Right, now live on YouTube, Chairman.
Good morning and welcome to East Devon District Council's virtual standards meeting on 13th of October 2020. I am your chair, Councillor Cathy Gardner. I would also like to welcome anyone watching the meeting via the live streaming. All participants here today are taking part remotely, and as well as being live streamed, the meeting is being recorded, so please bear this in mind throughout, and may I remind you to be careful with your language. May I also remind members that the Code of Conduct applies throughout this meeting. We also reserve the right to remove and disconnect any participant who is disrupting the meeting by whatever means. Please turn any telephone devices off or to silent. As this Standards Committee meeting is dependent on internet connection and a power supply, in the event of a break in the internet connection or a power cut, please bear with us as we try to reconnect. After 15 minutes, if we are not able to reconnect, we will consider the meeting adjourned and reconvene at a later date. Please check the committee page on our website for details. Please make sure all microphones are muted when you are not speaking to avoid any background noise levels. Keep points short and please do not repeat points that have already been made and do not interrupt. I also ask that you don't eat or drink during the meeting. If you wish to comment, please raise your electronic blue hand and wait to be called. Please do not talk at the start and end of the meeting, or the comments will not be heard during the live recording. All councillors have been sent the agenda for today's meeting. Any members of the public who want to view the agenda can do so by visiting our website, www.eastdevon.gov.uk. We will now start the meeting by doing a roll call of committee members here present. Can you please now unmute your microphone? And when you hear your name, please confirm by saying present. When you've confirmed you're present, please remember to mute your microphone again. Chris.
Councillor Gardner.
Present.
Councillor Barrow.
Present.
Councillor Bond.
Present.
Councillor Reliance. Councillor Twith.
Present.
Martin Guscombe.
Present.
Councillor Nelson.
Present.
Councillor Sott.
Present.
Okay.
I
know that.
Correct, so.
Thank you. I know that Eleanor is connecting from France. I didn't get an apology from her for today's meeting, so we'll assume she's not attending unless she does connect during the meeting. Agenda item 1 is public speaking. As far as I'm aware, there are no members of the public registered to speak. Agenda item 2, minutes of the previous meeting. If anyone has a comment on the minutes from the 21st of January, please raise your blue hand. I appreciate this is a long time ago now, we're in October. Councillor Loudon has a blue hand up. Councillor Loudon, do you wish to make a comment on the minutes of the previous meeting?
Oh, sorry, Chair, I don't know how that's happened. I haven't done it. To my knowledge, I apologise.
No problem. Councillor Twist, you've got your blue hand raised.
I was just about to say, Chair, good morning, by the way, everybody. Good morning, Chair. Yeah, they're fine. Actually, as far as I'm concerned, so very happy to second your proposal if that's what you wish.
Thank you. I don't see any other blue hands, so I move those minutes as correct, and those minutes are agreed. Item 3, apologies. Did we receive an apology from Eleanor?
I haven't received one, but I will add hers if required. Councillor Jarvis would wish to extend apologies as well, but he's not a member.
Okay. Agenda item 4, declarations of interest. Can we have the roll call for declarations of interest?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Gardner.
No declaration to make.
Councillor Barrow.
No declarations.
Councillor Bond.
None, Chairman.
Councillor Rylance is still not here. Councillor Twist.
Declare an interest. I sit on DCC, the Standards Committee, and for the purposes of agenda item 8, I sit on the Council of Governors, excuse me, at the Royal Devon and Exeter NHS Trust, Hospital Trust, apologise.
Thank you. Mr. Goscombe?
No declaration.
Councillor Nelson?
Obviously, I'm also the chairman of Broadhenbury Parish Council, but I've just been appointed as the deputy chair of the Blackdown Hills AOMB.
Thank you. And Councillor Stott?
No, none. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Item 5, matters of urgency, there are none. Item 6, confidential exempt items. There are no confidential exempt items which officers recommend should be dealt with in that way. So moving on to matters for decision today, agenda item 7, East Devon Standards Regime. Henry is going to take us through the report for today, and then non-members will be asked to make any comments by raising their blue hands, and then I'll move on to the committee. So over to you, Henry. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, committee. Firstly, an apology. The report doesn't have a finance comment in it, which it should. I do have the comment, and I'll read that out to you. But perhaps I'll just do that now, and then it's done. The finance comment is, the report recommends an additional staffing resource to meet the revised complaints process. If approved, this will be a recommendation to council for a supplementary estimate, new budget in year. At a grade 7 post, this has a salary range of between 29,577 and 32,234 with on costs. The full cost will be between 38,450 and 41,904 for a year as a full-time post. This full amount will not be required for the current year, but will then form part of the ongoing budget as a full year salary. I also just comment, I think that's written in the anticipation of change. It's obviously just highlighted by me that if change was to occur, then that's a necessary element. In terms of the report, it covers a various sort of range of various different issues, if you like. Obviously, there was the Committee on Standards in Public Life report, which it covers. It also talks about our standards process, the Standards Committee, and it also talks about members' interest, registers of interests. So it covers quite a multitude. I mean, the report explains it all, so I don't propose to go through it in any great detail. I think perhaps really the only thing to note is that the chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life has written to the councils asking for an update on how councils are doing in terms of implementing best practice, which is highlighted in the report. And I think what's probably missing from the recommendations currently is just to say that having discussed the recommendations on best practice, that the committee would agree to a response to the chairman going from the council, which I would write in consultation with the chair of the council, or it can go from the chair of the council if that's the wish. But I think we will need to formally reply, so that probably needs to be considered as well. But I think other than that, it's probably just for general discussion, and I can input into those discussions as necessary, Chair. Thank you.
Obviously, I appreciate that there's quite a lot of different elements come together, as you say, for this report, and it's kind of bringing a lot of potential changes together for a number of different reasons. We've got the recommendations of the Committee of Standards in Public Life, but we've also got some suggested changes coming as a result of the new administration, and some thoughts about some changes to make to the standards regime to make it in some ways smoother, more transparent, and other elements that have all need to be looked at together, because if we're going to make changes to the Constitution, we need to make them as a chunk. I also appreciate, though, that some of these things may need further thought. We may not be able to make all these decisions today. I'm also very mindful of the fact that some of us were in a 9-hour meeting yesterday and probably not as rested and alert as we would need to be to contemplate taking on all these changes today. the subcommittee members had to keep concentrating for a long time yesterday. So it's been quite tough. It's unfortunate, actually, we've got this meeting today. It would have been better, actually, to separate it by a few days, but hey-ho, we're here. So can you just, Henry, please, sort of summarise for our benefit where the different suggestions have come from, because it's quite a long, there's quite a lot of them. We've got the changes that we almost need to make as a result of the committee's on standards in public life. Do we want to deal with those first? Would that make sense? I'm
getting worse at this. I think it makes sense to deal with them discreetly and sort of in the order that they're coming through the report. I mean, there is one part in the best practice recommendations that would potentially be superseded by subsequent discussions. But I think rather than having a sort of a round conversation across all of the various issues, if you wanted to go through them in the order that they appear in the recommendations, I think that would be logical.
Yeah, I think that would make the most sense and make it a lot easier to deal with. So is there a good page in your report for us to start? I'm just scrolling through the best
page
practice.
9.
Page 9, just got that.
I mean, if it helps, I mean, a bit of a back. I mean, the report from the Committee on Standards in Public Life is a background link in the papers. If it helps, what the committee did, they sort of broke it down to two aspects in the end. They have made a series of recommendations to government with changes that they would like to see to the regime, but they have also then made a series of best practice recommendations to councils, which councils obviously can choose whether they want to adopt or not, irrespective of the recommendations to central government. I suppose that the point to note from the report was January 2019, and the chair, at least, is getting rather twitchy with the fact that the government haven't responded to it, although one can appreciate why in the circumstances that have been ongoing, certainly since they reported with Brexit and now COVID. So one can understand, but the chair has written to the Secretary of State asking when they can expect to receive a report. And I think even though that's delayed, of course, if primary or secondary legislation is required to implement any of those recommendations, one can see that's probably slightly or is likely to be much further down the line because it's going to have to fit into the parliamentary timetable and of course be drafted. So I suspect that if the government are to change, and I think it's likely there will be changes, I suspect some of those recommendations in terms of sanctions, for example, are likely to be taken on board by the government, but I can't see it happening anytime soon. So in the meantime, the consideration is what do you do in terms of best practice? And obviously in the report I've assessed or tried to assess how our regime compares to the best practice recommendations. And there are a few in there that probably could do with some tweaking. But I think if you just start at paragraph 9 and work through each of the best practice recommendations with discussion, then I think we can go from there.
Okay. Right. Are any, if we start on point 9, which is actually on page 9 of the agenda papers, I think the challenge is actually who, I'm just going to look up my blue hands to see if anybody sticks a blue hand up. Interestingly, that starts with the point that members on the subcommittee were discussing yesterday about the wording around the bullying issue in our code of conduct. We got that first on our list here, and I know that Bob and Martin had opinions about the way this was phrased too. Do you have any thoughts to add on this at this point? Martin, I can see you raised your hand, and I can see that Phil Twist has got his blue hand, and Bob's waving as well. So, assuming that this is probably the easiest way to do this. Martin, do you want to make any comments?
Yes, the comment I wanted to make, I mean, apart from the fact that the hearing yesterday, I think, did identify the need to have a further look at the wording of that paragraph in the current code, but I'm aware that the LGA have published a revised model code of conduct, which is still under consultation. And that does include actually 2 new paragraphs that deal with bullying and harassment as part of their civility agenda, if I might call it that. So it might be prudent to watch that development with interest, with a view to potentially incorporating the suggested wording from the LGA into our own code of conduct when this is finalised, hopefully later this year.
So just to, excuse me, I've run out of voice after yesterday. Just as, so what you're suggesting is actually that we don't necessarily make a change now. It might be wiser to wait and see exactly what the refined wording is. Otherwise, we might find ourselves having to change it again. Because I think the wording here is quite critical, and we realised that yesterday. Yeah.
I think it would be prudent. I mean, I have looked, I reviewed it this morning, and the wording does seem to address the wording in the new LGA model, albeit it is a draft, does seem to address the concerns we had yesterday.
Okay.
Sorry, Kathy, can I just ask, so the wording that is in the report, which is taken from the model code, you said that it's been has it been published, a further version's been published, did you say?
The version
I wasn't aware of that.
The version I looked at had been updated, not just along the lines you were showing, Henry, but it was amended to address issues of harassment as well, which is currently missing, I think, from our own version. And as I say, it's part of a wider agenda, which is to shine the spotlight on civility as an issue. So it's a bit wider just than bullying and harassment even. So it just seemed prudent to watch that development, which is a national development, and see if we can incorporate their wording hopefully later in the year when it's finalised. We could change it now, but it just seems wise to wait a little until this becomes clearer.
Sorry, what I was trying to get to is the wording that is in the report.
Yeah.
Is what I have taken from the LGA draft model code, and what I was trying to work out is whether there is a further version of it, or whether that is the one that's in the
the version I saw this morning was later than the one you are showing.
Okay.
Okay, and it does actually seem that the change at the moment that they're suggesting was quite minor, and it seems that actually they probably are going to put more clarity in there. Yeah, and I think that's going to be important. Councillor Twiss?
To let Bob speak first, I value his opinion, Chair.
Okay, Bob?
Chair, I'm sorry to admit, I don't actually know how to put my blue hand up, but maybe I can have training later, so you'll have to make do with that. I'm looking at page 9, best practice 193. So the new LGA model code of conduct that Henry has taken from the LGA model code, it actually changes the issue that we had yesterday. It changes a semicolon before the phrase "an abuse or misuse of power" to a comma. And actually that would fundamentally have changed the discussion yesterday. So I'm not quite sure what the solution is. I think we need either to be very clear about the issue of power and authority in bullying, or we need to be very clear that the issue of power and authority is not a consideration before considering offensive, intimidating, malicious, insulting, abuse, blah, 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 and so on. So if we agree to this, we're agreeing fundamentally to alter or change what was actually quite, for me anyway, quite an important point in the discussion yesterday, and actually which I think Councillor Twiss came round to accept in discussion, that it was difficult for us to try and tease out what we should do as a result. Thank you.
Councillor Twiss?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it was a long day yesterday, but I had a good sleep last night, so I'm quite happy to do another 9 hours today if needs be to get this right. I think it's really important that we get through as much of this work as possible. As you know, I was concerned about this particular section of the Code of Conduct yesterday, but we have to deal with the situation as we are today. Knowing how the LGA worked, I've sat on one of their boards before. It takes a long time. Just because there's a consultation happening now, there's no guarantee that the results of that will be implemented as a policy anytime soon, particularly with the way things are with COVID. So all that is being suggested in here, and I'd be happy with the movement of the comma. It's a pity that the movement of the comma wasn't there yesterday, but it wasn't. So we are where we are, to quote the phrase that the chair hates. And I would be very happy at this time to have some certainty by very simply adding on the word harassment, which is what appears as the suggestion here, and then to move on to the next item. Can I just ask a question first of Henry, though, just a little bit of advice on this? If we decide to adopt this today to change the code of conduct, when does that become effective? Is it immediate, or do we have to wait until our annual meeting to change it? It's just that tiny detail really that I'm interested in. But at the moment, I'm very happy to suggest we include or we add the word harassment to those two paragraphs, which would have, I think, solved my issue yesterday. Thank you.
Chair, if I may, so council can amend the constitution in year. So if standards was to make a recommendation now, as it works its way through, it'll be as and when council considers the matter.
Okay, so therefore then if there's another paragraph to add, let's say in terms of harassment that does appear sometime within this council, we can always add it on at a later date. So it's not like you've got to wait a year to do it. So I don't see that as an issue particularly. So let's get to a position, I hope, where we can agree to just add the word harassment, and then if needs be, revisit this if the LGA policy is actually adopted. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bond?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm just, I wasn't in the sub-hearing yesterday, so you've got the advantage over me when you're discussing bullying and harassment. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the amount of work that there is to do on each of these items, if we've been, I don't know, 10 minutes on the first one already, is it worth getting a working party together and actually really getting this sorted out in a slightly more informal way and bringing it back to committee at the next meeting?
I think that may well be necessary, because we might find, I think a lot of the other points that we're going to go through are probably a lot more straightforward. We've actually started with one of the grittier ones. But I think there may be other aspects as well that require some further thought, because some of the changes that I've been talking to Henry about actually quite significant and do need to be thought through quite seriously. I'll let Councillor Twist come back again, and otherwise I think we need to make some kind of decision and move on this point.
I think we can probably work through this a lot more quickly, because there are, for example, on best practice 4 recommendation, it is considered to be the case. So I think we can work through a lot of them. It might be an idea to see what's left over. That's better.
That was my thinking in the way I was going to do this. Is I think some of these points are quite straightforward. So
it looks like actually this is the meat of the agenda today. There isn't a huge amount on this agenda, and this is actually the meat of it. And I suggest if we're here at 5:30 this afternoon, perhaps we do revisit tongue in cheek.
Yeah, no way, because I think some of us will just leave. Right, I think on this bullying and harassment point, I think the conclusions, from what everybody has said, and Henry, you can pick up on this, is that actually I think we're probably fairly happy to make the change proposed and include the word harassment. I think also having examples, specific indications, as you put it, may also help. So I think what we're probably going to need is a suggestion around what that's going to be, what those changes are going to be, because we haven't got a final paragraph written here, have we, Henry?
Sorry, you haven't got a what?
Well, there isn't a final suggestion on this agenda paper as it stands, because you said harassment doesn't appear in the code and could be added, as could some specific indications of how bullying might happen. So if you have some thoughts as to what the text might say, we could then approve that.
So I think you could, in terms of harassment, I think it would simply say you must not harass or bully any person. I think it just switches it round because of the following wording in brackets relates specifically to bullying. So I think that's a fairly easy thing. In terms of specific indications, that was one of the comments that was made in the report. I mean, actually, I think that's a really difficult thing to do because it's only when you see it that you can then make a judgment call. I think what might be deemed to be bullying in terms of the wording that's in the LGA code, for example, I think is quite good. Sorry, model code, I should say. I do understand the moving of the semicolon. So can I just perhaps clarify that a bit more? Because obviously I wasn't in the discussions that were going on in the breakout room yesterday. So would the intention be it would read insulting or humiliating behaviour, comma, an abuse or misuse of power or authority, then the semicolon, which attempts to undermine or coerce or has the effect of undermining or coercing any individual group of individuals? Is that what you're looking to say?
Yes, I think so. I'm now looking at Martin's ARGA, and on my current view, I can't. Oh, there's Mark, and there's Bob. Bob and Martin were particularly concerned about this yesterday, but I think I think that's probably what we're asking for. Yeah,
because I think the only thing I would, it's very difficult to say here is an example of bullying. But I think what the LGA are doing is trying to sort of bring it slightly more into the modern world of saying, well, it could be face to face. You've got social media, emails, phone calls. Any of that can be used to bully. I think it'd be quite right to, if you wanted to rephrase it to include that kind of wording, but to give a specific example of bullying would be very difficult. Yeah. I think that's what I was trying to refer to, really. It wasn't a specific example, but it can occur in any of these scenarios.
Yes, and it is always going to be the most difficult thing to determine when it comes to a standards complaint, because it's such a tricky issue. But
does anybody have anything with the wording from the LGA model code on the bullying? Because it might just be easier to say, you could keep ours as it is for the moment, say you must not harass or bully any person, but then take the wording that's below and put that in the brackets instead.
Yes. Yes. Everybody happy? You can just nod if you think that makes sense. Yeah. I think that's the simplest thing to do. Done.
You've got a couple of blue hands, I should say.
I've got a blue hand and I'm waving as well. I don't know what else I want to do.
That's okay. I see Councillor Rylance has joined us. Okay, Councillor Bond, do you have...
Well, just I wanted to just say, I wasn't in your meeting yesterday, but I can imagine if you're discussing bullying and harassment, that's really difficult. But it's how the person receives it that makes it bullying. So some people can just brush it off and they're absolutely fine with it in whatever walk of life, whether it's politics or school or workplace or whatever. But it's actually how that person receives it, and if they feel bullied, then you have bullied them. So it's far more complex that between people, if you like. So it is a really tricky one.
It is indeed, and it will remain so. And it's very difficult. Councillor Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. So I was intrigued by the removal of the in the bullying intentions, the intention to coerce. Because it seems to me that in politics, that's actually quite an important concept to keep. There's going to be a lot of, we do a lot of persuading. We spend a lot of time trying to explain why one position is better than another position. And it just seems to me that bullying in political terms would probably involve a fair amount of coercion. And I'm just wondering why that's been removed in the draft new version. Perhaps Henry could enlighten.
I have no idea. I didn't write it, I'm afraid. I don't know what their rationale for it is. It just appeared their document is actually quite short, and it is effectively the model code, and that's all they've done. They've published the code. I know there's been some seminars and discussions about it, but I don't think anybody's really picked through the bones in that sense of understanding some of the well, it's not changes, but some of the recommended wording. I don't think anybody's really gone into that level of detail. You can make for the committee. You can make an amalgam of this. and take the sort of the more modern approach that the LGA suggests, but you could keep or has the effect of undermining or coercing within ours. I suppose the difficulty is of trying to, I mean, it's not a snap decision now, but it's in trying to actually hone the wording at this moment in time during the committee. It's not going to be a particularly easy thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I can have, if you want to carry it, I can have a go at it.
Is it possible, Henry, so that we can move on, for you to take this as an action item to consider really merging those two things together? Because I don't think we should be losing the word coerce. I think Eleanor's right about that, and I think those elements, but merging the modern points of listing the mechanisms of bullying. It's not just threatening somebody in face to face, but also social media and emails, and merging those two things together, and then we can approve that subsequently to today, because I don't think we can write it now.
No, and I think some of the things that the report identifies is you're going to have to make a choice today whether or not you want to have all these things coming back to standards to make an onward recommendation, or whether you want to effectively make the recommendations now, which are then presented to council. And you could say, I've got a very clear steer that you want to make it modern, but you want to keep the subtlety, but also not create the confusion of where that semicolon was. I get and include harassment. I understand that. I can do the wording. And that could then be considered by council as part of the package if that's where this debate ends up going. So understood. Perhaps just leave it and we'll see how we get on during the rest of the debate, and then I can perhaps summarise what the sort of outflow of work will be and how it will go forward. So if we just park it and come back to it.
Yeah, I'd like to move on to the next item, unless people are absolutely desperate to continue on this, because we've been spending a lot of time on this one. Councillor Rylance, have you got another quick addition?
No, thank you, Chair. Sorry, I'll put my hand down.
Okay. Martin? Martin, I can see you waving your hand. I can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I got it in there. If Henry's going to look at the wording, can I just ask that Henry does have a look at the wording that appears in the LGA's new model, which, as I said earlier, now comprises 2 paragraphs, the first of which deals with bullying and the second one deals with harassment. And this does seem an opportunity, since the committee seems minded to update the wording, to draw in the harassment side, which is currently missing from the code altogether. It seems wise to take the opportunity to draw that in and make the code more robust than it would otherwise be.
Thank you. I think that makes sense. So Henry would have a note to look at a revised paragraph for bullying. Moving on to best practice 2. There's 2 provisions here actually that, and Henry's commented that we don't have. They don't have it in the LGA model code, and we don't have it either. I'm not sure how you could enforce either of these.
No, and therein lies the problem. I suppose again, it's like a lot of these things, isn't it? It's the by signing up to comply with the code of conduct, you're accepting that the responsibility to engage in the process rather than just sitting back. So, but you're right. I mean, it's a breach of the code for not complying with the code to engage with any investigation. So it's a difficult one, really. I understand why they're doing it, but I don't really think it will achieve very much. If somebody's going to be stubborn about it, they're going to be stubborn about it. And if they're going to go down fighting on, let's just say courtesy and respect, they'll probably go down on not engaging in the investigation as well.
It just strikes me that it may be why then neither of them appear in the draft LGA model code, in that they've also realised that they're not. They sound nice ideas, but they're almost impossible to enforce. I can't see how you would either prohibit trivial or malicious allegations. Yes, I think absolutely. The purpose of sifting or reviewing complaints as they come in should therefore put that to one side. I can't see that adding those in is. Does anybody think we should add those in? Because I think if we're going to, we really need to be clear how we would implement them.
Can I just make one? Can I make one comment? So in the webinar that I watched the LGA when they were presenting the LGA code. I did raise this with them and say it hadn't been included, and they did say they would look at it. Honestly, I think it's one of those things that it's an expectation. You're drawing front and centre the expectation of what members will and won't do. But as ever, it's whether members then comply with it. But yes, that's what I need to say. Thank you.
Yes. So my view is I don't think this is going to add anything. Councillor Twiss, are you going to disagree with me?
I'm not going to disagree with you. I absolutely agree with you on this. It's a complete nonsense. It might be best practice, but we can't implement it. How the heck do you measure trivial or malicious allegations? One thing to one person is something completely different to another. So I think we need to strike that out and move on to best practice 3.
Yeah, I don't see any other blue hands. Okay, so best practice 3. Principal authorities should review their code of conduct each year, seek and get the views of the public community. I think basically we are reviewing and taking suggestions on board, as far as I understand it, through this committee in any way we need to. Henry, do you have any comment on this one?
Yeah, so I think I suspect actually what this is really driving at is the public engagement in the code itself. So what has happened is that the council back along in 2011, 2012 adopted this code, and then it tweaks fairly routinely as part of the constitutional review every year, but then also as a bespoke review carried out by this committee. But what doesn't happen, other than obviously hearing the independent person's views and also the town and parish reps' views, other than that, there isn't a wider engagement piece in the suitability of the code. And I think what it's driving at is, you've got a lot of stakeholders out in the district. They should have the opportunity to have an input into it too. And I don't know whether that happened in 2011, 2012, but it certainly hasn't happened since 2015. And I think it probably would be a good idea. Obviously, people have a lot of concern about councillor behaviour. And if people are feeling it's not working, they should have the opportunity to comment on the suitability of the code. Whether the council then adopts anything on the back of it, well, that's for the council to decide. What I think is dangerous, though, is going out every single year. It seems to be advocating that you do it very routinely. And I just cannot, well, it's a balance, isn't it? I don't think you'll get much traction year on year on year. You might get an initial a fairly good response rate initially, which would justify it, but year on year on year, I can't see it. So I would suggest every 3-4 years, or maybe shorter, but at a fairly regular point, you go out to the public and see what stakeholders on the public and see what their views are, and we can start that now, but certainly not every year.
Yes, I tend to agree. I can see a value of having a review, the ability for people to look at what we're doing, because if we're proposing making quite a number of changes, it seems like a good time to also go out for wider input. Susie.
I agree, actually. I think 3 years would probably be about right. But I wondered if we do any benchmarking against other councils to see what they do with their code of conduct, and whether we could sort of learn best practice from them.
Henry, do you have any comments on that? I would have thought that that's the purpose of what the LGA have been doing, but
yeah, I'm not sure if it's particularly beneficial to be taking the views of the councils themselves. I think this is about it goes to confidence in the system, doesn't it? And really, what you're aiming, what the LGA are aiming to get is the views of those who are subject to and are trying to use the code of conduct to deal with councillor behaviour. Other councils are kind of vested in that. I say that towns and parishes within the district, of course, that I can understand it might be worth seeking their views, but of course they adopt their own code or they can adopt ours. So there's a logic there, but I'm not sure about whether you could go to another council and obtain best practice, because it's down to what's appropriate for you as a local authority or us as a local authority in terms of member conduct. So I'm not sure how benchmarking would work. I think as a process about whether people go out for engagement, yes, you could do benchmarking, couldn't you? But I think in terms of the wording, it's a bit horses for courses, I think.
Eleanor.
Thank you, Chair. So I agree that I think going through a full review process yearly would be quite an onerous task, but I'm just wondering whether there isn't value in actually keeping like a window in which, if we discover in the course of the year that there are particular problems, we can actually decide whether or not to go to have a revision that in that year. And maybe just somebody keep a running total of the number of problems we've come across in the year, and we decide whether there's enough to put together into a formal revision process. And maybe leave a window open yearly to do that. Because I'm just thinking that if we do come across a major problem, having to wait 3 years or 4 years is actually quite a long time, and it's quite a frustrating length of time to have to wait to implement changes that need to be made.
I don't think that's what's being suggested here at all. I think we can change the code, our procedures for the code of conduct and things around the code of conduct through changes to the constitution at any point during the council year
on an ad hoc basis.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I think what Henry,
fine, then.
as far as I'm aware, what Henry does generally with the constitutional things is to kind of get to a point where there are a number of things that need to be changed, and then those go through full council, having come through the various routes. So I think for us as a standards committee, if we get, like, if for example we have a particular complaint comes through and the code doesn't help us resolve, then that may tell us that the wording needs to be changed in some way, and then we can put that through. So it's not about that, it's about going out to the public, and I think finding a way to do that every few years is probably quite nice, certainly to the towns and parishes, to make it more open. And if people want to look at it and make comments on how they think the standards regime works overall, that could only be helpful, I think. Given we're doing some major changes now, perhaps we should factor that in a few months' time to do that.
Okay, thank you.
I can see Phil waving again.
Yeah, my blue hand's not working very well today. It was just a thought that an awful lot of there is an awful lot of misunderstanding out there as to what the process and so on is. So what I'm going to suggest is, being it is currently considered the case on best practice 10, we move that up the running order to sit under best practice 3, because the two are kind of linked, where people aren't necessarily aware of how they complain, what the process is, or what would constitute a complaint. So it's just very simply, in terms of our report that goes to council, to move number 10 up to sit underneath number 3, and number 10 doesn't appear to be contentious. That's all.
That's fine. I mean, I think, we just go through them as the order they are on this list. If it makes sense when it goes to the next level to change the order, that's fine, or group them in some way. That's fine. Susie, are we still on number 3?
Well, no, it's just a general thing. You've raised a few times now that there are going to be major changes coming through, and I wondered how that actually, I'm trying to get rid of my finger, how that actually impacts what we're discussing now. What changes are you proposing as an administration to bring forward?
Well, I think one of the main thing is the proposal about having an assessment subcommittee, which would be a new subcommittee for standards, which actually then would change the way in which the process works. So we'll get to that in a bit, but I think let's keep on this list before we start discussing another topic. So moving on to 4, we've seen that we've got that already, unless anybody wants to raise number 4. Councillor Miller.
Hi, thank you. How prominent is it? Because I was just on the website now and I couldn't really find the code of conduct very easily. So I just wanted to ask the monitoring officer how prominent he considered it to be, and whether we could look at potentially making it more prominent, because I think it is really important to make it as prominent as possible on the website. I mean, it's not on the home page. I can understand why that might be, but having clicked into a few links, I still can't see it very prominently.
Okay, so if you click on, from the home page, if you click on Council and Democracy, it's one of the links that is on that next page.
I think that also links to best practice point 10. That it's our website sometimes can be not that easy to navigate. What's on the front page can change as well. But I think maybe we need to have a consideration that it's related to 4 and 10 are basically the same point.
So if you've only got 6 links on the landing page, the main 6 links. and then you've got to click on A to Z of more services, which causes all sorts of, when you start going through all of those. But under Council and Democracy, if you click on that link, on the next landing page, there are a number of subheadings, but the middle one, which is effectively front and centre, it's got councillor conduct, it's got the code of conduct, how to complain about a councillor, councillor complaint decisions, councillor reminders, declarations, councillor allowances. So there's quite a neat section there that encapsulates all of this. The council's going to have to decide whether it wants to have planning applications, which is a massive hit, as opposed to having the code of conduct, which I can guarantee you won't be in comparison to planning, for example. You're going to have to weigh up which is more important. So I understand the importance, but I don't think having it necessarily on the landing page of the council, but at the next tier down, which is where it is now, I think is perfectly acceptable in terms of how accessible it is. That's my view.
If I may, Chair, if you go onto a well-known search engine and just put in EDDC Code of Conduct, it comes up number one on the list. And if you just click that, it takes you through. So it's quite in other words, I think it's reasonably straightforward to get to that link.
I think I've been looking through the website to find this. I did it this morning. I tend to agree with Henry. I think it is available through the council link from the front page. I think the most it would need is another word or two added to that part. I don't think we're that bad, and it is always difficult. It's not the most important thing people go to the website for. I'm not sure that we could change it without upsetting other things on the website.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing you could do, I don't know. So some of them have got 3 links under that top banner. For Council and Democracy, we've got who is my councillor and committees, meetings and minute agendas. I don't know whether you would have to, if you could add a third one there and have it, or whether that would unbalance how it presents. I simply don't know. I can certainly ask, but as I say, I think the balance is correctly struck in the sense that Councillor Twist says you can actually search through well-known search engines and find it, or 2 clicks and you're there. So to me, I think the balance is correct. But if you want it front and centre, I can certainly investigate whether it could be added as a banner. As a link under that headline banner.
I don't think that overall we're going to need that. Does anybody strongly think that we do? I'm not seeing anybody frantically saying we should change that.
Waving.
I think
Kathy, Bob is waving to speak to you.
I can't see Bob on my screen. Hello, Bob.
I'm obviously in a lower scale picture on your screen. Could I suggest that you actually add it to the East Devon District Council app? You have a separate section in the app, which actually is pretty good. I mean, I know most people probably refer to it in terms of, when's my bin going to be collected, but you could put another little window on it and have a whole section on this.
That's a very interesting suggestion. I have to admit, I use the app for bin collections and nothing else. And it works really well. But it is a thought that having it through the app would make it quite easy, although I suspect we'll have to bump a button off the main screen of the app, wouldn't we? I don't have my phone here.
It's externally controlled as well. I think you'll find, Bob, it's actually provided by CETA when we did the new waste and recycling contract. So it would be a great idea, but I'm not sure it's actually that practical or viable, except at cost to the council. But
okay, it's another impractical idea.
Well, you can get. Sorry, it is more than just the waste collections. It has other things as well. In fact, it does have the councillor lists.
Yeah.
So you can actually find all your councillors. But what I don't know, and I think this is the point, is whether there is then going to be a cost to adding the code of conduct as a discrete click within the app itself, or how that would present. Because you've got quite neatly, you've got 9 tabs in there now, which sit on one page, and if you start adding extra ones, it's going to, the honest answer, I don't know. I'm sure it can be done, but is it going to be worth the cost of putting it in there, and potentially how it would affect the layout for the rest of the things in there? But I can certainly take it back and we can investigate that.
Anyway, it's just a thought, Chairman.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a good idea, and I think if it can be done very simply to direct people to the website where the full information is, then we've got what we need as a helpful answer.
Chairman, could I just say on the earlier point about communication, I mean, clearly you have to go out for consultation periodically, but there is absolutely no interest in my parish or any of the other parishes I attend, as I can see, in this issue whatsoever, until of course there is a complaint. So if you send out communication to my parish, you'll just get a reply from me. Well, I'm on the committee anyway, because I can't get anyone else interested in it. But the wider point is, which is not for this committee necessarily, but it's a consideration. We are absolutely bombarded with stuff from district and county on which many departments want our views. And if you just add in, you know, code of conduct as well, it's just going to go in the pile. And we always have to make some decision. I have to make some decisions of, you know, which parish councillor is really going to read through all this stuff and come back with sensible opinions, and then we can respond. We're getting more stuff than we can possibly deal with. And it's not just district, it's county as well. And it's from advisory bodies and quangos and government bodies, vast amounts of data. So maybe districts should think about, you know, when it goes out to consultation on something, what is the juxtaposition of that particular consultation with anything else that's going out at the same time? It would be nice if it didn't all come in waves, but I'll leave that.
Yeah, I think that is a consideration. If we are going to do it with the code of conduct, we need to do it in a very low key way. If people feel that they want to, they can have an input. Then there's absolutely no requirement to do it. And we don't want to make it onerous. It's not the most exciting topic in the world for the vast majority of people. It just matters an awful lot to a small number of people. So we were saying about the website and the app. I think we just, if we come on to 10 in a moment, so that we want to look to see if we can have something on the app that's really simple. That came out of number 4, but it does relate to number 10. Number 8, updating the gifts and hospitality register and publish it in an accessible format. I think Henry's position here is that we're doing everything at least that well already, so there's no change necessary for us.
That'll be my view, Chair. I understand the recommendation about a CSV format file, but that's with the perspective of there is a register, a physical register, and that information should be uploaded. That's how I took it. We have a live system that you can interrogate all members, time periods, and more often than not, people are not interested in what all councillors are doing. It's going to be a particular councillor they want to see, and you can go to our website, you can click on the councillor, and you can go and see what interests they've declared. So from my perspective, I think actually it's a better approach that we've got. I mean, I don't know whether we can, I'm sure we could, behind the scenes, download all the information to a CSV file, but I'm not really sure what you gain by doing it. The information is already publicly accessible and live.
Yeah, I think we do it in another way, but the information is accessible, and I think that's the important point, isn't it?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay, moving on to 6. Should publish a clear and straightforward public interest test against which allegations are filtered. I think this again is an area we perhaps could make this simpler and more transparent on the wording in the website, which links to the point that Phil Twist raised about relating to 10, is to make sure that everything is very clear about how the process works. And if we're talking later on about an assessment subcommittee, that will be extremely important as part of the remit of that subcommittee, is filtering and the reasons why. So making that clearer and more prominent is probably a good thing. Henry, do you have anything to add on that?
Not at the moment, Chair, no. I mean, the test is there. So yes, at this stage, I think it's part of a wider picture.
Okay. Number 7, Henry, do you want to comment specifically on this one?
Well, yes. Well, it's I'm going to repeat what's written. So we had 2. We've now got 1. We need to recruit for next annual council, and I think the similar vein of some of the concerns picked up, actually having alternate views or the ability to take more than one view is probably a good thing. And also we need that person potentially in another set of processes as well. So I think it's probably wise to go to recruit to.
So is the decision on that one then that as we're recruiting for next year that we look to recruit 2, not just 1?
Yeah.
Is everyone happy with that?
Slightly confused, actually, Chair. We've already got an independent person. Are we losing our independent person? Because we've already got.
And I should have had the courtessy. I think I am.
Thank you, Henry.
Oh no, sorry. I was going to. Is Alison in the call? Yes, she is. I probably should have had the courtesy to talk to Alison. But the independent person is appointed for 4 years, and then that term can be renewed for a further 4 years. Alison's 8 years expired in May this year. But with COVID and everything else, the council agreed to extend it for a year so that we didn't fall in not having one. But it does mean that in May next year, we will need to be recruiting for a new independent person. And my suggestion in light of the recommendation, and also because we had 2 previously, is that we actually recruit 2 rather than 1.
Yeah, makes sense.
Good. That's one decision. Right, best practice 8. Which we do anyway, so I'd assume there's no change needed on that one. I'm looking for blue hands on my screen. I can't. Apologies to people who are waving. I can't see you, but I can see the blue hand. Pauline, did you want to come in there? No.
No, I was just putting my hand up because I can't find my blue hand. Sorry.
I can see you on the screen at the moment as well, so you're all right there. So that was 8, fine, 9.
Can I just actually, just for the sake of helping the committee, I don't think it's not a big issue, but just to explain my comment, which suggests that I don't follow it all the time. The reason being that some of the complaints are quite so clearly without merit. They don't relate to our functions. That don't relate to our councillors. That I wouldn't go and consult the independent person on something that has absolutely no point. So anything that falls within ambit, I would go and talk to the independent person about. But those that clearly don't, I wouldn't. So that's why I put on the whole.
Okay. Number 9 is about the publication of findings following a formal investigation. Now, obviously, I understand that if it's a hearing, it's public, and the result of normally public, and the result is published, and that's what we do at the moment. This is going beyond that. In the suggestion is to publish the findings where it's earlier in the process. Is that correct, Henry?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a conversation that comes around every so often, and it's a really difficult balance to reach or to strike, I should say. I can see it from both sides. The point that has arisen, though, is that there's an argument to say, well, why bother making a complaint if at the end of the day there's no sort of outward learning or ability for those to see that the process is being adhered to or sanctions and whatever you might want actually occurring. But our process as written currently allows the subject member to treat the complaint as confidential, irrespective of outcome. Now, the reason for that, I think on the whole, is to protect the position of there's no smoke without fire, so that if there are lots of complaints being made, the very fact that they are being made can be used against somebody, even though those complaints may not be upheld. So by allowing a subject member to treat it as confidential, you're protecting that position. But conversely, it also allows them to keep a negative decision confidential as well. So I think the logic would be, and this is trying to reach the balance really, that if a breach is found, if a breach is found, then there's no reason why the outcome shouldn't be made public. Is sort of the middle ground, I would say. I think it's fair to say that if there isn't a breach found, then I think it would still be okay for a subject member to keep that as confidential. They could choose to publish if they wanted to, but that sort of presents a sort of a hybrid approach to it, and I think is an acceptable one, because then the breaches can be publicised in the sense people will then, and the public generally, will have confidence in the system to know that it is operating and working. Whereas at the moment it seems slightly skewed towards the subject members, I think. But it is a difficult balance to strike, and I think, allowing non-breach letters to be withheld, I think is the correct approach, though, rather than all decision letters being published. Now, this also plays into the later conversations about what one does with the process as a whole. But I think perhaps you're welcome to have the debate now, but I wonder whether you might want to hold off and consider this, depending on what you do with the potential for an assessment subcommittee, because it does, that will overtake events if that's the way we go. Hope that's not too confusing. I probably confused you by saying that.
Yeah, I think this issue is to me, it's a discrete one, because a finding of a breach at an early stage in the process, it can be quite a serious thing that somebody has done and has been therefore found to be in breach, and then nobody really knows about that, and it makes people wonder if anything happens with the standards process potentially. Pauline, I can see your hand waving.
Yes, having been through the process and being taken to the standards by a member of the public who actually printed all the details and explained to the papers that I was guilty, and after a course of a year of going through the papers, actually keeping on printing that I was guilty and then found innocent at the end. And then there was no findings that I was actually innocent. And I think that is wrong, because if a member of the public can actually go to the papers and actually not have the confidentiality, even though they're meant to, and then the person who has been subject to being made guilty, found or not found guilty, you've got no comeback. And I think that is wrong, because I think if a person is innocent, then that should be reported to the papers that it is innocent. It's all right within councils, but it's when the public get involved and they spread it around the papers or social media or whatever. I just thought I'd bring that to your attention, because for somebody who's been through the process a long time ago, it was not a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's a very good point about having flexibility in this, to ensure that in certain circumstances, it is important the person who's been complained about, if they're found not to have breached, may also want the flexibility to make that known. But I think it's got to be handled really carefully, and I think Henry's made the point that we can't just routinely publish every finding, because it can result in the one thing that we shouldn't do is allow the process to be used in any way in a vindictive or political way. Then the system itself becomes bullying, and we can't allow that to happen. I'll go through the blue hands. Councillor Miller.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just picking up on Pauline's point first. I think it's a really good point. And maybe the rule should be that if the innocent party requests that decision to be made public, then that will be followed, because there has to be that flexibility. Because I really agree with Henry about the whole no smoke without fire thing, because any member of this council could put in various vexatious complaints against another councillor. And if all of those non-breaches were published, the public might think, well, there's a lot of complaints against this councillor, so there must be something that this councillor is doing. So, yeah, I completely agree. And I'd also just like to say that I think Henry's completely right about this balance to strike. I think when a breach has been found, I think it's really important to have that decision published. I mean, I was in a hearing yesterday, and that decision will be published. But I have complained about another councillor, and I thought it was a very serious complaint. It was upheld, and the outcome was confidential. And indeed, when I shared that outcome, I was found to have breached the code of conduct and had to give a separate apology. So actually, I think that this recommendation to publish breaches, I think it resolves that issue. So I think it's a really important best practice recommendation, and I hope the committee adopts it.
Yes, thank you. And I think those of us who've been involved in the standards process on either side know that actually sometimes you think, well, that it would be good to make that public, because it's actually how the process should work. But it has to be a little bit case by case as well. Eleanor.
Thank you, Chair. So I really agree with the general principle of transparency and making decisions that went against the person complained about public. However, we have to be mindful that things that are on the internet never go away. I mean, at what point are people able to redeem themselves? Is redemption possible in this situation? Are people able to expiate their misdemeanor or crime? If you're convicted of a driving offence, then eventually that offence will be struck from your record. If it's on the internet published online, it will never go away. So I do think there's quite a lot of implications. So transparency, yes, but also the basic rights of a person to redeem themselves have to come into play at some point. So I kind of agree with you, Chair, that it should be on a case-by-case basis, but it's going to be a tricky one. It's going to be a really tricky one, I think, to get right. And that said, because it is possible to make vexatious complaints and also print stuff off, as former Councillor Stott said, it could be something that just is held against somebody's record, even if there is no claim found in the end. It's a pretty tricky situation, really, and I suggest that maybe there are possibly different levels of breach. That possibly it should be viewed on a case-by-case basis, whether or not it is published. Really,
I think the difficulty.
I don't know. I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is that you can be found guilty of breaching the code on the same clause, and that decision be confidential. And because it goes to hearing, it's public. And to me, that doesn't make much sense because it's the same clause being breached. Just the process is different. And I don't think that's proportionate. But I think, and also we're publishing these findings from hearings already, so they are out there forever on the internet. And I think that's just the nature of what we're dealing with. I think there's one more blue hand I can see. That's Phil Twiss. Thank you, Chair. But the risk of being flippant, the answer is very simple. Don't breach the code of conduct. Anyway, let's move on from that. I quite like the idea of Henry's middle ground. And I think it's important we discuss this now, because it may be that when we get to the later item, we don't agree with setting up a subcommittee. That's not to say I don't. I've not heard it. I've not even thought about it yet, but I'm just saying that I think we need to, in principle, say that Henry's suggestion of the middle ground and how it's publicised is actually quite a sensible one. So at the moment, I'm supporting that as a good idea, but obviously that may change later in the debate. Going on to the point Ella's made about when are you redeemed, I would suggest in some ways never, because we're in the business of being in the public domain. We are expected to maintain certain standards, and we had this discussion yesterday about we set the tone for the council in terms of upholding standards, and sometimes there are things, I don't know, let's say that have happened in your past that are relevant to the work you do on a council. So standards is very important as far as I'm concerned, but I say just dealing specifically with this best practice 9, I'm suggesting the middle ground is good, but we may need to revisit this particular item later in the meeting. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Henry, are you clear on where we are with that one?
Well, yes, I think the position is that breach letters will be published. So that will be an onward recommendation, I think, because it's quite a fundamental change to the process, and that would require council's approval. But yes, I'll note that the committee are looking to progress that, and we'll work back how we move it forward.
It may also be added to the list for future discussion, because I think the point that Pauline made about the ability for members to make results public, even if they're not, if the results are not a finding of a breach but a non-breach.
Well, that's currently the case.
Oh, so they can make it.
Yeah, they can.
Okay.
So, I mean, there is. I mean, that's exactly the reason why, I think, because there's only so much control the council has over the process, and if somebody does go to the press outside of it, or the press get wind of it, however, and accusations are then made, actually the member may say, yes, I do want to publish it because I've been exonerated. So that right is already there, but it's too far that way currently, in that it also precludes or allows them to stop the breach letters being published. And I think that's where the subtle distinction arises, that you can change that bit.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to move on. Best practice 10, we've already touched on looking at the wording around this to make sure that this is as simple and as clear as possible. I don't think we need to add anything more at this stage, otherwise we're going to be discussing that in too much depth probably. Best practice 11 doesn't seem to help us. I don't think that's a recommendation.
No, and of all of the best practice recommendations, this is the one that strikes me as being the most bizarre. And we have a classic example of why it wouldn't work.
Yeah. So moving past that, number 12, the role of the monitoring officer. It seems that we already do that. So there's nothing to change, nothing from the model code from the LGA to change either. 13, procedures in place to address conflicts of interest and undertake a standards investigation. I thought we could do that already. Can we not do that already? So we don't need to make a change on that anyway. Yeah. 14, it seems that's not necessarily relevant to us, although that may be reviewed separately.
Yes, I think it is part of a wider piece of work. I'm not really sure what the relevance of the committee of that being a best practice for them specifically. I do know that the portfolio holder for democracy and transparency, this is an issue that is on his radar and he will be looking at.
Yeah, and I can understand why that might need to be looked at, but not as part of this committee. Yeah. Councillor Twist, do you have points to make on on that one?
Yeah, it was just on the point about outside bodies. We have no influence or control over what outside bodies do. Yes, it's one for a conversation at some point in the future. We had quite a major review, and Pauline will know this. I can't remember when, probably 5 years ago, because we seem to have hundreds and hundreds of people, outside bodies over which we had no control whatsoever, and often the views were being reported as those of East Devon District Council, and yet we had no control over it. So there was quite a sift, and it's probably a good time to have a review of that actually. But say it's really just making the point. There are some things which EDC are involved with. Let's think of, I don't know, Science Park as one, for example, but we're not now the Lockyer Observatory, for example. That's not one. That's an outside body over which we have no control. But I think there's a piece of work to be done on it. Thanks very much.
Okay, right, moving on to 15. It seems that basically that's available as an option to happen anyway. So I don't think that requires any change in the way that we work. Right, moving on, I think point 10 is around the formation of an assessment subcommittee. This has come up when we've realised that actually that there is an option that other councils follow that we haven't previously followed, and I can see situations where it could be very useful, improving transparency in the process and making it clearer how the process works, taking some of the weight off the monitoring officer's shoulders and the decision-making process. Obviously, I can also see that there are situations where this may be quite awkward, and I think that Henry might want to explain where it might work well and where it might be quite difficult to do it. And this, I think, is a piece that may require separate work before we can proceed. Can you give me your thoughts on this, Henry?
Yes. Well, perhaps how do I start? So if I was to say I was slightly ambivalent about it, I think this really comes down to what the members want and what the members want to be seen to be doing in the process, because it was a very bureaucratic and sort of unacceptable process before, and of course the Localism Act freed it up for local authorities to have their own processes for dealing with complaints. And I have to say, I think the vast majority have taken the approach that we use, which is the monitoring officer sits as the sort of first arbiter in terms of what complaints progress, outcomes at initial stage, and decisions whether they go on to investigation or referral to police or whatever. Where a subject member doesn't ultimately agree with any of the outcomes, then they have the ultimate recourse to go to the standards committee for a subcommittee for a decision. But that necessarily means that members aren't involved at the early stages of the process, and they only really become involved right at the end if there's a subcommittee hearing. So it's perfectly permissible for the authority to say, actually, we would like to be involved in that early stage, and that's where the assessment subcommittee would come in. The process that East Riding of Yorkshire have got, and most of them have got similar veins, is that actually the monitoring officer still has an initial sift, but I think it's sort of far less acute than it is currently. But there is an initial sift process, and the monitoring officer has to report to the committee on those sifts that have occurred, such that a subsequent report isn't brought to the committee. But anything that progresses is then presented to the subcommittee for its assessment, and then the subcommittee decides how something moves forward, whether it goes to investigation, whether it's capable of resolution, and then effectively it carries on through the process in the normal way. But what it does is it adds a step that allows the members to have that early engagement. So certainly East Riding, they have a slightly bigger committee, and I think we would have to consider, if this is going to move forward, to do the same, because of the need to be able to call on people. You need to be considering timeframes and all sorts of other bits and pieces. The one thing from my perspective would be slightly counterintuitive, and that one would feel you're taking work off the monitoring officer, but actually I don't think you are, because you are increasing the sort of bureaucratic side of it in terms of the reporting processes and all the rest of it. So whereas at the moment, a lot of it's done by email to say, no, there's nothing here, I'm not going to be progressing it, for example. That would have to go through a report and be reported back to the subcommittee, and any decision that the subcommittee need to take would be on the basis of a written report. So there is going to be a lot more bureaucracy involved in it, and I make no judgment on that. It's just a fact, I think, and necessarily I would need resources to be able to deal with that. But fundamentally, this is about what the members want their process to look like. It's totally within your gift. There is. I'm not sure I'm in the process. I'm in a position to be able to say pros and cons in terms of examples. Personally, yes, some of the decisions are not always easy to have to investigate. Sorry, some of the complaints are not always easy to investigate, and it would take some of the pressure off that. But then equally, you're introducing a bureaucracy that doesn't currently exist in it, and that may cause delay and frustration and other bits and pieces. So I think there's pros and cons, but as I say, ultimately this is down to the members to decide. What do you want from your process? Do you want to have an early engagement in it? And if so, then this would be the kind of process that you'd be looking to adopt.
Thank you. From my side, this is something that I think is extremely interesting. I think it's a way of making the process of when complaints come in and how they're handled more transparent. With member involvement, it gives members the opportunity to be very clear about, that one should not progress for reason X, Y, Z, perhaps not really well founded as something that takes more time. And it's clear then that members have been involved in that decision, rather than the decision just happening completely in secret between the person making the complaint and potentially the member being complained about, and the monitoring officer. And I think that's caused people some concern in the past, is that they're not allowed to talk to anybody about it and they don't know what's going on. They don't necessarily understand the decision. So having an assessment subcommittee means that members are involved in going through and looking at it. I know there may be issues around, may also raise the points about confidentiality, but I can see how it would really give a lot of people more confidence in the process overall of how standards works. And I think that from an administration point of view is something that we're keen to do, by just bringing that out into the open a bit. We don't also, though, we've got to be aware of the no smoke without fire issue, that we can't be seen to be looking at a load of complaints against one person, because that again has the problem of saying, oh, there must be something, when what we want to be doing is saying, no, if this is groundless or a rather strange complaint, that we would also then knock it out and people would know why. So I can see positives. It may be difficult for town and parish complaints coming through that can be more complex. We obviously know we've got issues with one of our town councils. That may be something that has to go quickly through a subcommittee for further investigation, but at least a number of members would make a decision. The other point I want to make before I look at the blue hands is a consideration of cost, is that we always have a cost when we use an external investigator. And so I think an assessment subcommittee would have that in mind as well, to make possibly it clearer as to when it should be possible to resolve something through direct, I think, sort of face-to-face, I've forgotten the word. What's the word? My brain has died after yesterday. Where people actually are sit down together. Mediation. We're beginning with M, thank you. Mediation. I don't think we use enough mediation in this council for resolving complaints between individuals. And that is something that the subcommittee might also be able to say, you know, we should really consider mediation to resolve this, not that it progresses to an external investigator, which is expensive and time consuming. So I think it changes the process subtly. So I'll shut up now because I can see a benefit to doing this with more members on standards, because I think it's going to need more people to be able to make it work. I'll go outside the committee first and then come back to committee members later. So the first non-committee person on my blue hand list, and I can see you waving there, Pauline. Don't worry, I can see you. Is Paul Miller. Do you want to make a comment about this?
Yeah, insofar as I think it actually addresses best practice 13 as well, because where the recommendation is about addressing any conflicts of interest, because what the subcommittee would then do, with the monitoring officer can then refer it to the subcommittee rather than have a conflict themselves. So I think it addresses that point. And I think you're exactly right about increasing the numbers on the standards committee. Having just from my view, a hearing subcommittee, it increases the awareness amongst the membership of standards issues. And I think it would be good for councillors and their awareness of the code of conduct. I mean, I must confess, I did undertake training on the code of conduct when I became a councillor, but I wish I'd studied it more. And I just think having that hearing subcommittee where I don't know whether it would
assessment subcommittee.
Yeah, assessment subcommittee. Sorry, having that there in the public, it would be really good for the public to be able to see, you know, what qualifies as a breach and what doesn't. And as you say, it makes the whole process more transparent. So yeah, I welcome it.
But yeah, and I think I'll just clarify the assessment subcommittee's aim really is to be part of the sifting process to decide which complaints are worthy of further investigation and you know, really serious enough, and which could perhaps really should be resolved with individuals directly, and which just should not progress any further. I think it can be done in a way where everything is kept confidential, so that we're not exposing the names of the people involved, but we're looking at the nature of the complaint itself, which is a good way of doing it, because it means that we're not judging it on anything that we know. I'll come to Pauline, because you were waving your hand.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just going to say, in the order of transparency, would it not be good for yourself to actually be with the monitoring officer and sift through them yourself as chairman? Because I think in most sort of committees, the chairman always works with the person, whoever the head of department is. And so therefore, I think that would be a good idea, rather than setting up another committee in which you've got another lot of confidentiality to deal with as well. And also it's the bureaucracy of everything as well. The more paperwork, the more time the officers have to spend. Whereas if you just went with yourself, you would know all what was going on and you can sift through it with him. Thank you.
That's an interesting suggestion. I hadn't considered that. I don't know. I'd be interested to see whether anybody else thinks that's a good idea. I mean, obviously at the moment, the chair is also not aware of complaints coming in. So it's a possibility. I think I prefer the idea of there being perhaps 2 members and 1 independent person being involved in the subcommittee to assess, rather than just relying on the chair. But it's a possibility. I'll be interested to hear other people's views. So blue hands, I can see 3 blue hands at the moment. So Eleanor.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so this is a slightly left field idea, but could it be part of the Councillor's Code of Conduct that every single member may be called upon in a sort of jury system to sit on the assessment subcommittee? So my thinking behind this, bear with, is that everybody would have to be aware of the Code of Conduct. It would be impossible to subvert the process, because nobody would know in advance who's likely to be on the assessment subcommittee. people would sign the code of conduct right at the start of their term of office, knowing that they may be called upon to sit on an assessment sifting committee. And I think it may improve democracy for the entire council. I mean, that's I don't, numbers to be determined. I don't know how many people you'd want to have examining cases. I would suggest maybe 3 at most, or 3 or 5 at most, to decide whether they're going to proceed. And I suggest that as a subcommittee, people wouldn't need to meet in person, and so we could carry on with COVID level distance examination. So it might make it a lot easier to organise with random people drawn out of a hat. Just an idea.
That's another interesting proposal, because getting enough members available to do this role is a challenge with a very small standards committee. So that's another interesting thought. Susie.
Thank you, Chair. I'm concerned about the bill that goes with this proposal, given the constraints that we're facing at the moment. So, an extra 40,000 for another member of staff. They have to be cut somewhere else in order to do that. But I like Eleanor's idea, as long as the assessment team were, although drawn out of a hat, was still politically balanced. So there was no pressure from opposite parties, if you like. But I'm assuming that within that process, I mean, there must be a huge number of looking at the end of the agenda, a huge number of complaints that come to Henry and his team that are filtered out straight away, and no one's suggesting they should go to a committee to be looked at. Are they, or are they? I mean, it just seems to be over the top, really, because some of them don't hardly progress at all. They just are waiting for more information to come in. So I just wondered what your thinking is at the moment as to whether every single complaint should go to the assessment, or whether they can be weeded out first. But I'm initially concerned about the costs, and I think that puts it lead in the water and just think of a different way.
No, I think you've made 2 good points. I think I don't think all the complaints that come in will come to the assessment subcommittee, because I think there are definitely some that just don't even meet the criteria of being valid for various reasons. And I think those would still get sifted out as they normally do. And I think that's part of the process, as it would be written down, is to define the criteria, which ones are just knocked out straight away, which ones go to the assessment subcommittee for decisions on future action. And it just takes that second part of the process that Henry does. The first bit is it valid at all? Yes, it's valid. Now what do I do? So it's the second part of it's valid. Now what happens? And the issue of cost, I think, also concerns me. I think that trying to propose a cost of around 40,000 for the first year seems impossible at the moment. And I think it's a question of how we could manage it without needing so much additional bureaucracy, and keeping it as simple as possible, based on the fact that this is something that Henry already does as part of his job. It's just having Henry do it with the involvement of a few more people, and keeping that as simple as possible. I can see 2 more people. I can see Martin's waved at me, and Phil Twist. Phil, do you want to speak, please?
Happy to hear Martin first, Chair.
No, go ahead, Phil. Let's hear you now. Your blue hand was there. Okay.
I see the merit and I understand the thinking behind this, but my first reaction as well was 40,000 quid's a lot of money we could be spending on something else, because you can overthink these things. I quite like the idea of planning a DM where there's a kind of sifting there, where the chairman's meeting, the delegation meets chairman and deputy chairman meet to make decisions. I can see a case to be argued for a model for that, with chairman of this standards committee and another member from. This is assuming that it's gone through the first initial sift from Henry. But it's about perception as well, isn't it? Because the outside world, you will see people of a deeply suspicious nature, like me, will see potentially the opportunity for manipulation of the process, without giving away too much of my tradecraft. If you look behind my head, you'll see a sign there for British Airways, which is an ancient poster I've had with me for about 40 years. And in my day job, it's quite interesting the way that the complaints handling process works, where let's say you go away on holiday, you come back, you weren't happy, 100 people make a complaint. There's a reply that goes back, first part of the process. Some people are happy, some aren't. The next part of the process, you might have 10 people are unhappy, and so it progresses. And my concern would be that by overcomplicating the process, the layers of bureaucracy, you would perhaps dissuade people who have a genuine grievance to think, oh, I can't be bothered with this, it's too much of a pain. The other thing as well with members, judging members, not necessarily in public, because as I see it, the subcommittee it's not envisaged, correct me if I'm wrong, for the subcommittee to meet in public. It's not good in terms of the transparency. I think generally the system we have at the moment works pretty well, but I can see the merit definitely of going down the route of the suggestion by Pauline, and also perhaps doing as per the planning guys at the moment, and also saving us 40,000 quid. So in principle, I think it's a reasonable suggestion. It takes a little bit of the pressure off Henry, but my concern, I suppose, is the blurring of lines between operational and strategic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Martin. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I don't think it's just the money. It's you can put a cost also on the bureaucracy that would go with this. We're talking potentially about tying up a fair number over a year, a fair number of councillors and no doubt other paid staff to service these arrangements. So I'm very cautious about that. But I think the thing that gives me most concern is in terms of the relationship with the public, who look in on what the council does. And we start with an arrangement where these allegations are filtered and reviewed by a professional officer, the monitoring officer of the council. And the public can have a lot of confidence that this does not involve political interference, it doesn't involve fear or favour, it involves an individual who's excellently qualified to look dispassionately at the circumstances and come to a view. And Henry's position is made even stronger because we know that in certain circumstances the view of the independent person is brought to bear as well. And of course, in extreme cases, particular cases that are viewed to be serious enough, then the matter goes forward for independent investigation by an expert. Now, I think from a public perspective, that is a safe, robust system. And there is a danger that quite apart from picking up a lot of cost and a lot of bureaucracy, we do damage to that very simple relationship with our public.
Thank you, Martin. It's interesting that actually I think if we were going to do this, we would want to make sure that we built more confidence with the public rather than less. And that's why how it works and who's involved in it is really critical. Because I think that's why councils do it, is because it makes that first part of the process of deciding whether complaints progress or not more open. So people can see the nature of a complaint that is carried forward and how serious it is and how far it goes is clear, rather than at the moment, most complaints are never even seen and you just see the odd one pop out. So at the moment, it's like a black box. I saw Henry wants to comment. Before we go back to Henry, do you want to let Pauline comment first, Henry?
Up to you, Chair.
Yeah, Pauline.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. I was just going to say, can I up mine to the Chairman meeting the monitoring officer and one of the independent non-councillors? Because I just think that then the public know that, you know, yourself as a councillor and an independent person has looked at it with Henry. And I just think then you've got both sides covered. Thanks, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Henry?
Yes, I was just trying to see if I could find something sorry, I was just going to say that there were recent calls for the monitoring officer to be legally qualified, and that's partly because of issues like this in terms of the role that is expected of it. Anyway, that's just kind of an aside, really, but it goes to what Martin was saying. For me, my personal view is it's either one or the other, and the reason for that is that in terms of confidence in the system and who's doing what, I can understand, perhaps go back a step, of whose decision it actually is. So critically, you'd have to make it very clear that it is the monitoring officer's decision in consultation with, as opposed to the other way around, which would then, of course, give the power to the individual councillor. And then, of course, that brings the political, very clear criticisms of political decision making. But irrespective of that, my view is that I think you do one or the other. I'm personally particularly comfortable with having a sort of a delegation style approach to it. I think it would be better that if you're going to do it, you do it as a subcommittee. And it isn't that the committee time itself has to be particularly intensive, but it's how the information is presented to the committee. And I think that would also apply to the delegations. I know in the planning delegations, they still write the reports up and they still present it. And I think if you want confidence in the system, you've got to have that process that is robust. I know how I apply the system, and I'm comfortable with it. But if we're going to change it, I don't think we want to be looking at the delegations absent a reporting type approach. And if you're doing a reporting type approach in a sort of delegation style, well, then you might as well do it through a subcommittee, because that is probably a more robust and safe way to do it. In either case, if you're doing a reporting based approach, invariably there is increased resource. I don't like coming for asking for the resources. I just think it's going to be a necessity. And as the report says, this is not an officer just coming asking for resources. But if you're going to do it, I'm going to have to say I will need the resources to administer it. I personally think that should sit outside of the discussion of what is the right thing to do. What you want to deliver, it seems to me, is a process that both the councillors and the public critically have the confidence, councillors at both tiers, and the public have the confidence in, and that will be what it will be in terms of the costings. And the legal obligation is to give the monitoring officer the resources he needs or she needs to deliver. So I personally, and I know it's in there, I know people are obviously very conscious of the budget, as am I, but I think that is a secondary issue in comparison to actually getting the process right. And the final piece of the jigsaw, I think, in terms of confidentiality, and I quite like the so each riding do it on the first letter of the councillor's name. So Councillor X, Councillor Y, Councillor Z. Personally, I don't think the first letter helps. I think you should do it on a completely anonymised letter basis, because some councillors, we're okay here with A's and M's and a few other letters, but there are some where you've only got one letter and then it's very clear who it is. So you do it on an anonymised basis. So actually the subcommittee is not considering it, knowing who the member is. And actually I think there's I know who the member is. So I think there is a sort of extra safety net there, that you take out any element of who the member is, and the subcommittee are blind in that respect, and it is purely about the behaviour. Now, I know I can do that, but the confidence of the public in that is reassured, isn't it, if the subcommittee is considering on a completely blind basis. So that would be my...
Thank you, Henry. And I that's something that appeals to me, is that what you're actually looking at is the complaint, the nature of the complaint. So you're taking out any knowledge of the people involved, and you're just looking at the nature of the complaint. And I think the benefit of the public seeing that too, and other members, is that it makes it clear the kinds of complaints that come forward that people just go, what? Where did that come from? And I'm glad to see that's not being progressed, versus, oh, I was worried about that and I never thought about making a complaint, but now I can see that it is important and it is suitable. So I think it acts as a helpful communication, and it may reduce the number of complaints that you have to cut out at the first stage, because people understand what's serious and what's not, and also make more confidence in how complaints are being put forward. And if we can we can introduce mediation as well into the process as another factor, which has been recommended to me as well externally from another council. That's a good idea, is that we're actually making our process more transparent in a way about complaints themselves, but not the people, and increasing the effectiveness of the system. But I think we should look at whether we want to do that and then worry about the cost element later. How do we now move forward with this item? Should we take a vote with the committee about how we feel, whether we're prepared to support having a, say, further investigation of whether practicality is setting up this idea of an assessment subcommittee or not? Is that the next best step forward here?
I think you've got a choice. You can either just bite the bullet and do it and make the recommendation to council as detailed, or you can bring it back sort of with a more bespoke set of arrangements tailored to us. I guess it's how keen the committee are to make the change, if that's the decision. I think actually, in terms of if one was going to say let's just replicate what East Riding do, actually it's a pretty straightforward process, and you could just make the decision. I think if you're going to tweak it beyond that, then I think you have to consider it a bit more and probably have a further report.
Does any committee member want to make a proposal on whether we move this forward to council as a recommendation, or whether we need to do further work on it? Because I think it is a significant thing to look at, and the details are going to have to be correct. I see Councillor Twiss's blue hand. Councillor Twiss.
Thank you, Chair. For me, this needs a lot more work. I don't think we can make a recommendation to adopt. I know nothing about East Riding. I'm sure they're a fantastic council, but I'd like to see some examples from other places as well. Apologies to Dean, he might be from the East Riding. Actually, I'm not quite sure, but no, okay. So for me, I would actually propose that we have a report, a further report, a detailed report, fleshing out the ideas we've talked about today, come back to standards in due course. But I can't support at the moment just going ahead with adopting the East Riding model, and I can't support actually spending that level of resource currently until we know what the position is in terms of finances for next year, which we know is going to be incredibly difficult. I'm not sure we gain that much. I accept public perception and openness and transparency. We had this discussion yesterday, absolutely all for it, but it's going to be quite hard, I think, when it comes to budget making time to justify it. So that's my proposal. Thank you.
Councillor Bond.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Terrifyingly, I agree with Councillor Twiss.
Steady on.
I know, I'm just really quite concerned. But at the beginning of this agenda item, there are 6 recommendations, so we can actually hive off some of those. And I tend to agree. We need more work on this, particularly given the, well, I know Henry said you should put the costs to one side, but actually I think I can't.
Anybody else have an opinion on next steps? I think it's clearly a complicated issue that needs to be worked through before we can make final recommendations to implement this. It's a question of how we would work through that, whether we task Henry to work on this, perhaps with a bit of help. Councillor Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. So I think you just answered one of my questions, and that was that Henry would be presumably doing the work on this. Is it possible for Henry and the person helping him to draw up some kind of cost-benefit analysis, maybe, because that seems like it might please Councillor Twiss and various other members, if we could actually work out where the benefits come from versus the costs of doing this. Is there any potential saving if we were to introduce a case assessment subcommittee? Would that save some of Henry's time, for example? I mean, I think, you know, this is probably something that we should be investigating, because if we are asking for extra money, then, you know, maybe there are savings that can be made on somebody's time somewhere else if we actually come up with the right model. So that was my question, really. Do we anticipate that there are any potential savings from proceeding in this way? Obviously, there are potentially very clear democratic advantages, but are there any potential financial savings as well from sparing maybe Henry's time looking at cases, some of which may be entirely specious and not worthy of his time? But if we could get members to look at those, then, you know, obviously it would be potentially cheaper. I don't know. So that's possibly a question for Henry.
Yes, I think before Henry comments on that, I think the view has to be that standards is standards and the code of conduct has to be done irrespective of cost. But there is obviously, there's a cost element in officer time here, but there's also a cost if the external investigator is used. If we minimise the number of cases requiring the external investigator, that would reduce the cost. But I don't think the cost, I mean, I know we have to consider the extra cost if we need an officer or part of an officer, but I think we have to take that decision separately. If this is an important issue that we want to do, then I think we would have to put it forward and ask for the resource to do it. If full council doesn't accept that, then we can't do it. But I don't think we should take that too much into consideration. Henry, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a very difficult exercise for me to do, because it will be dependent on what and how the subcommittee operates as to the potential time savings to me specifically. I think all I can say is, what are the potential cost implications vis-a-vis the various schemes that, processes that might be put in place directly. And I can see, looking at the East Riding one, that is a clearly more bureaucratic, not in a negative sense, but it is clearly a more bureaucratic process than we are currently operating, and that will come with a cost implication. I couldn't project what savings may or may not arise, because that's down to the decision making of the subcommittee ultimately. But I think it's picking up on taking that sort of initial work out from me. There is still the initial work for the monitoring officer to sift those that do not meet the basic standards to go forward for conduct, consideration of whether or not the code of conduct has been breached. If that threshold is reached because they are a member, they were acting in official capacity, blah blah blah, then it will go forward to the subcommittee. But that initial work won't change for me. But what I won't then have to do is go on and do the straight considerations, and that will be the role of the subcommittee. It will then come back to the monitoring officer to progress investigations and all the rest of it. So, I think perhaps a bit more detail about how this potential option, and also whether there are other options, and how it might work specifically in East Devon. I can see that there's going to have to be a further report then, given discussions. But yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult for me to pinpoint the actual cost of the process, because it's unknown. It's looking at how it's operated, I think, is going to be the key issue. But I think, picking on what the chair said, I think that is right, that you've got to get, the council has to get the right scheme, and it's not cost be damned, because it isn't like that, but you've got to get the right scheme and the membership want, and then you have to resource it. I think I can't see that there's any other way to look at it, really.
Okay, thank you. We need to move on, because I'm really conscious of.
Yeah, sorry, Kathy. I was going to say, so I think in light of that, if you wanted to defer for further report items 2, 3, and 4 in the recommendations, because I think they all go together. You could take 3 separately if you wanted to, but it strikes me that they are related.
All right. We'll go through the remaining items and then come back to the recommendations and decide how we progress those things. But it just seems like there's a chunk of work to be done there before we can really look at that properly. Can we move on to the next subject, which I think is point 15, reviewing the register of interests forms. I think this is a matter of actually just changing what's on those forms to increase the amount of information that we're able to show, basically.
So yes, this is a matter that has been discussed a couple of times by the committee in terms of the content. I mean, it's ultimately for the council to decide what it wants to have on its forms. So this form has been provided as one that is very detailed, and I have my views on that as against the information that's on our forms. I think initially the predominant concern was separating the interests of the relevant person, the councillor's interests, which have to be declared, and also those of the relevant person, which the councillor also has to declare. Our form, as is currently set up, doesn't allow that to be neatly or obvious, let's put it that way. So I've presented in the papers an alternative approach which would allow that to happen, but there is then a conversation about whether you want even more detail to go in there. The only concern I've got about the level of information that is in it and taking the Annex 2 on page 29 is that stretches to over 10 pages of information. And bear in mind, that's a PDF that's uploaded to the website. We've got issues with our accessibility requirements now in terms of how the public access our information and whether or not that's a suitable way to be progressing, because our modern gov system, which we use for declarations, couldn't replicate, or at least I don't think it could easily replicate what is contained in the other example that's in the papers. So I've no doubt there's a balance to be struck. We could very easily change the form to separate out the relevant person interest. It's just, I think, a conversation about how much further you really want to go. Just bearing in mind those particular things. But I think it will be, if we're going to go along the lines of the report from, I can't remember where it's from now, the Rydale. If you want to go along those lines, I think we have to again scope that in a bit more detail. It's exactly what modern gov can do and see if we can replicate anything along those lines. But really, it's for a decision as to whether you want to go down that far or whether you're happy with amending it at this stage just to include the relevant person as a separate category.
Okay, Martin.
Yes, Henry, I may be able to help because I did have a look to see if I could find something a bit simpler that seemed to address the issues you were worried about. And the one I'd recommend is the one from Dorset Council, where I'm very happy to send this to you. But it's only in hard copy terms, it's only 3 pages. It splits between the councillor and their spouse and partner, and crucially, it's a modern gov system. So I would think it's ready to roll if you're happy with it.
Yeah. So there is we have put an example up there for with relevant persons within our system, but I'm very happy to receive it. And if the members agree to that, we can put that in place pretty quickly. Although all 60 members then have to go back and redo their forms, which will no doubt go down particularly well, I'm sure. But I think that the predominant issue is does the council want to go further than that and have a sort of much more exploratory form that Rydale used? But yes, if you could forward me the Dorset one, if you've got it readily to hand, that would be very helpful. Thank you, Martin.
Would it?
Sorry, I got interrupted by a phone call I just had to take. I'm the only person in the house, I had to answer it. Sorry, there were blue hands I did see. It's disappeared off my screen. Yes, Susie.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Over the last, not in this election period, but the previous one, we discussed at great length about having land interests listed. Sorry to bore you, Henry, because it's the old chestnuts again. Land interests listed on your register of interest by field number or land registry number or whatever they are. I think given some of the comments that have been coming out sort of fairly recently, that might be a good thing for people to do. If they have extensive land interest or any land interest at all, really. And I just wanted to sort of flag that as being something that I still think is, I think we put down that it was recommended, or we used some term that wasn't a mandatory thing to do, but it was something that would be best practice possibly. So, I would recommend that still. And certainly your significant other, whatever the term is, your partner, whatever, should be listed for that with their where they earn their money from during it within East Devon.
Thank you. Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. This is sort of related to an item you have on your agenda for latter discussion. But I personally, I abide by the ROI requirements and list the interests of my spouse, my partner, hence why I'm putting a request into you later on for a dispensation. But I've just, while the meeting's been going and I've been listening intently to the comments of the committee, I believe just from an initial view this morning of the members of this council, there's at least 7 who I know have spouses and partners who haven't declared those interests. So effectively, that's a criminal offence under the Localism Act. And it could be that councillors have misunderstood the form. So part of the reason that I suggested and to Henry, and I've been in communication with Henry about this, is to provide this clear delineation between the member and their significant other person, their relevant person, because then there is no confusion. And yes, it might require councillors to fill in another form. It's not particularly onerous. We fill in forms every day. We read thousands of emails. Filling in a 3-page, 6-page, 10-page form, it's just part and parcel of what we do. Councillor Twist touched on it earlier. We are held in the highest degree of standards. We must maintain the gold standard of probity. And so therefore, full disclosure of everything. And of course, the irony is not lost on any councillor in this room that the Localism Act was voted on by MPs who notoriously don't declare their own interests and yet push down on the lower authorities the need to do it. So I can't see any problem at all with having a form that clearly says one or the other. It removes all ambiguity. It removes any potential for, oh, I forgot, I didn't understand. And as for land entries, yes, I'm wholeheartedly in support of either an ordnance survey reference, a grid reference, what 3 words, whatever. You just put down where that piece of land is. There are examples on our system at the moment of descriptions of a piece of land. Well, where? With all that goes on in terms of planning and probity and public perception, we touch on this over and over again, public perception, the public would like to know where this piece of land is, especially if planning is ongoing and there's planning near it or adjacent to it or next to it. And again, I just don't think a bit more clarity on the form, because that's what's required. And I think it puts public's mind totally at ease. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Yes, my view is that more is better, and making these forms more obvious so that all members are really clear on what they should be writing in there and what they don't need to put in just makes everything much, much better. At the moment, we're leaving it to councillors' judgment to see, do I need to put that down or not? And that has potentially allowed people to avoid writing things down that actually it turns out really should be there. I see a couple more blue hands. Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, fascinating discussion. It seems to be going in exactly the right direction, I think, as well. As you've just said, you know, what can be the harm, the more the better. Just a note of caution, really, and not literally for the record, for the minutes, but of course, councillors are already fully aware of their duty to disclose these interests of partners, particularly as far as where they live. And what I'd hate to see is this council move on to a new and improved procedure and anybody say, oh, well, blimey, now I understand. I didn't understand before. I think all current councillors perfectly understand what their duties are. Councillor Hayward perhaps suggests that some of them haven't followed them, but that's, you know, that's I don't know about that. But if they haven't been, there's no excuse. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Leader. I think that's a good point. That if we're changing the form to make it easier to put the information in rather than squeezing things into the boxes by hand, then we need to also make it clear when we put that new form out that this is information that has always been required. But now we're making it even more obvious for the public to see what's recorded and boxes that don't apply, so that everything can be easily recorded. But it's no excuse to say, oh, now I know what I should have said and before I didn't, because you should know to declare everything now. 2 more blue hands, and I think we're going to need to make a decision. This also relates as well to the point about 16, about how we're going to move on talking about prejudicial interests as well. So there's another item discussed related, which is a similar issue. So I've got 2 blue hands I can see. Councillor Twist.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, again, I think we're overthinking this one. It's quite simple. Let's have a bit more information on the forms. I'm looking at the examples we've been given as current on the ModGov and potential for Joe Blogs on the one that Henry's given as an example. And I just happened to also have looked up the one for Councillor Hayward. So at first glance, if I was looking at this with a fresh pair of eyes, it doesn't tell me that the occupational healthcare assistant, RDE NHS, who that is. So absolutely, let's have a bit more information, because I don't think that's relevant particularly to Councillor Hayward, but it's more for information, being clear that I suspect that's his wife. I'm just, or have just completed a form for blood donation this morning. So I'll put us back on video, for blood donation this morning, where I'm unsure about a couple of boxes, so I can refer to the unsure about your any aspect of your donor health check questionnaire. So it's quite simple, just to put a few guideline examples up, as Henry has provided, which I would hope would clear up any sort of ambiguity about a situation. But yeah, perfectly happy to suggest we go along with the Joe Blogs example rather than persisting with the Paul Hayward example as listed on page 27 of our hymn sheets.
Thank you. Councillor Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. Two things. I thought we were supposed to be filling in our registers of interest on our council iPads now, so the issue of space shouldn't arise because it's endlessly expandable. And secondly, if we are filling in our registers of interest via the council iPad, can we have little help boxes which just pop up if you have a question, a query about a particular box, where you can just click the question mark and it gives you examples of the kind of thing that, you know, would be useful to mention. I mean, I was wondering if that's a useful addition we can make to the council iPads.
Just say, I think the
I do agree with
Sorry,
Hayward. Sorry.
Sorry, you go. Sorry,
go on. Sorry, Henry. No, I was just going to agree with Councillor Hayward about spouse interests. I think it's very relevant. Should be in the registers of interest. Sorry, over to you.
I think the idea of pop-up boxes, I think, might be technically just asking for more work to be done. I think the point of having it on the form is that it makes it really clear for any member of the public or anybody looking at your form as to where you haven't put something in because it doesn't apply, rather than knowing it's just not there and it's missing and somebody doesn't even necessarily know that it was an option, if you see what I mean. So I think the form, as being suggested with the modifications, is more helpful because it makes it really clear as to who's got the interests and what they are, and if they're not there, you're putting through not applicable, and it's a positive decision. That's, I think, taking away the what do I put in this box and what do I expect to see in this box if I'm looking at it as an outsider. It makes it really clear. Henry, do you have any final comment on this one?
Yeah, so on page 27, you can see there it says C note, which when you're completing the form, you can click on the C note and it does tell you what it is, but that's not on the public facing version. There is also a guidance note in the member library which details how to fill out the form and what they all relate to, which I spent a lot of time drafting prior to the elections, so members could be clear about what they were required to do. So I think what Councillor Arnold says is absolutely right. Members know, and they're reminded quarterly now, I think it is, about the need to declare. So that side I think is okay. I suppose the question is, and there's no problem changing it to include the relevant person to make it clear, because I can see that that's the failing within the form as it currently exists. And I'm happy if the committee agree we can just do that straight away. For me, the bigger issue is whether you want to move towards something like Rydale, because I don't know how compatible the Rydale type approach is with the use of modern gov. And I think that's the bit where I'm going to have to go away and do further work. If you want a lot more detail, so just take employment, office, trade, professional, vocation. I could put the text of what the C note says into the box, so it's there, but it's going to be a lot of text to explain what that means, as is name of sponsor, the sponsorship, as is. So it's going to be a huge form. It's going to be a lot of detail in that form. That's no problem if that's what the committee and the council want to do. Whether you want to structure it in a yes/no approach, I don't know how. As I say, I don't know how easy that is going to be to do in modern gov, which is the system we are using. So I think the committee needs to consider, yes, if you want to change the relevant person. If you want more, then we're going to have to go away and have a look at the form and see what we can bring back to try and meet aspirations.
I think we need to be making a recommendation that we look to make the simple changes straight away, so that the things are more obvious to people looking at the forms and it's really clear. If there's anything that we can't implement now, then that will have to be looked at to implement later. But I would think that most of the committee seem in favour of making.
Happy to second that. Very happy to second that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Make the change now and then come back with how practical it is to do it as a change.
To do more. Yeah. All right. Okay, I'm just going back. I've just lost my place in this. I'm zooming up and down the screen like a maniac. I think we're at 8.15, if I'm correct. 14, 15, 16. So we've covered 15. We're on to 16. This is again about declarations of interest, and a point about we have disclosable pecuniary interests. But there is another aspect to this that we could include, which is about prejudicial interest, which again increases the transparency. I think the concern is that when people are sometimes declaring an interest and sometimes not, and what some people mention and other people mention is not always the same thing. And it could be really helpful to make, again, a tweak to what we do to actually make it more transparent and consistent. Henry, do you want to explain what the change would be?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I quite follow that logic, Chair, if you mind me saying. So, because it's still down to an extent to people's interpretation of what it actually means. But what a further instruction might look like is that hybrid category where currently we have got personal, which you declare, but you're allowed to stay in, discuss, vote. And you've got DPIs, which are your financial interests, where you are precluded for the whole thing. What the personal prejudicial effectively reinstigates is the hybrid, which would be, it's beyond personal, but it's not quite pecuniary. And it's that you are effectively so potentially biased or I'm not having expressed that very well, but you are effectively going to be incapable of taking a fair decision that you will then be excluded from the meeting. And it's effectively that. So, but it will still come down to how people choose to declare as to whether it's successful. But there will clearly be some, and there is concern, isn't there, about some of the personal declarations that are made that people then carry on to vote, which they're entitled to do, but actually should they be entitled to? I think that's the critical thing. You know, is it right that if somebody who's got a massive extension 2 doors down from you, you don't have a DPI in it, but actually it clearly going to affect you, should you still be involved? So I use that as a flippant example because it's obviously you would be biased or predetermined and you step out from planning anyway. But it's to try and cover off that sort of slight lacuna where it's more than just a personal interest and actually you shouldn't be involved.
I think that's correct, and I think it's about public perception of, again, influence or involvement is making this really clear. And I think it's about applicants being connected to members and making it really clear that that is a prejudicial interest. There are lots of things which don't count as pecuniary, quite obviously, there's no direct financial link, but it could influence somebody's decision making, and I think that is a public concern of council decision making, particularly around planning. Councillor Twist?
Yeah, I get the bit about the hybrid which we currently have, which is a DPI and personal interest. The difficulty I have is how the heck do you monitor the prejudicial? Because, for example, I would like to think that people vote for me because they know me. So if for example, Fred Smith decides to put an application for that fantastic extension in my ward, whereabouts does my prejudicial interest come in when I'm making my comments on the planning portal, for example? I mean, I do upset people within my ward because I don't always agree with them, but that's actually beside the point. So I think there has to be a degree of common sense. But ultimately, Henry, can you answer this for me? Where is the onus to declare any of those interests, whether it be DPI, personal, hybrid, prejudicial? Is the onus on the individual member, and what's the sanction if they don't?
Yep, absolutely right. It is always the member's responsibility, and that's what I was trying to highlight earlier, that you can put in place whatever safeguards you think appropriate, but you're still dependent on the councillors to appropriately declare. Yes, the test for the personal and prejudicial used to be, would you invite them to your wedding? I think was always the, do you know them well enough to invite them to your wedding? Was the classic.
I got married once, that's enough.
Yeah, so because it is an interesting one, the personal prejudicial bit. But yes, you're as with all of this. I mean, the DPI is more clear cut, but you're still dependent on somebody actually recognising that they need to declare and declaring. But I think if the committee were so minded to look at the hybrid, the personal and prejudicial, there needs to be a bit more work and bringing back exactly what it might be, how it might be phrased in terms of the constitution, or more particularly code of conduct.
Yes, I think that's the point. I think the wording around what that would mean is perhaps clearer in terms of public perception than in whether it would influence your decision or not. And I think the example of would you invite them to a wedding, or would you do you have them around to dinner or whatever, is probably part of that. Friends rather than just people you know because they're in your ward, or relatives as well. Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. There was a case quite recently in a adjoining district to ours, where the son of a councillor was having some planning applications go through, and the member omitted to make a declaration on the basis that it wasn't his partner. Therefore, there was nothing to see, hear, gov. And I think, again, it's an issue of perception. What would the man or woman on the Clapham Omnibus think if they reviewed the case? And I think it's fair to say that if any councillors, children, all close relatives, and we can define close relatives, was involved in something that is a personal prejudicial interest. Similarly, if I belong to a club, and a member of that club who I drink with, socialise with, fraternise with, makes an application, that's a personal prejudicial interest. You can't get away from it. Councillor Twiss's point is well made. Does someone who lives on the other side of Councillor Twiss's ward, or the very top of Yardley ward, who I waved at once, yes, I know them. That's the nature of ward councillor. But all of this comes back to what Henry has clearly covered. It's down to the members concerned. But this, again, just clarifies that point and removes any ambiguity for, oh, sorry, I didn't realise. I didn't think. We all know. We all read the Code of Conduct. We've all read the press. We've all seen. And part of this is protecting the reputation of this council, because we're all the custodians of the reputation of council. So if any one of us forgets on an occasion to do it, I'm afraid that's not good enough. So if it needs clarity and something written down to hone down what we know, then that's what we do. And until such point as no one is pointing any fingers saying, well, it was your son, your daughter, your aunt, your uncle, your mate, and you should have declared, well, then we need to keep clarifying it until we get to the point where there is no longer any need. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, and I think the proposal here is that those things should be declared as a personal interest because you know the applicant, but you still then take part in the discussion and vote. And I think if we're looking at a personal and prejudicial, it's clear that your relationship with that person is going to influence your view on the decision. And that's the difference. It's bringing in that extra weight. Does anybody in the committee oppose making such a change? I'm just interested to see whether anybody thinks it's a bad idea. I think the more we can do to improve the quality of what we're declaring and how that's handled, the better the public will view the council. And that is a big concern that I have as chair of the council. Councillor Twiss again, quickly.
Yeah, I don't have any objection to it, but I just don't see how the heck you can enforce it. So there's no point in actually voting for this if you can't enforce it. The principle in broad terms is right, but actually, where do you draw the line between a legitimate inquiry as to what they're into what a person's interest is, and impinging on their civil liberties. It's a very fine line. I mean, I'm pretty clear as to what the law says on that, and I take the point on that what Councillor Hayward said about perception, because we've been talking about that a lot over the last couple of days, but I just don't see that we can enforce it. I think as it stands, we've got belt and braces, we have the checks and balances for planning, and we do know where our responsibilities lie. Otherwise, we're in the wrong business, for goodness sake. So, I mean, I accept what's being said, but I can't support it because I just don't think it's enforceable.
I think the point is that we are required to declare. It is a requirement, and it's a breach if we don't. Catching people not declaring is always a challenge, but it does happen. It has happened. And I think what this is doing is introducing another level of declaration here to make it even clearer that it's not just a personal interest, but it may actually influence somebody's decision making. And that's something that we don't have at the moment. Is that, Henry, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I was just going to cover off the enforceability bit, because it would have to be incorporated into the code of conduct as another type of interest, and the requirement to declare would be incorporated within there. So if it was found to have breached, that's where it would lie. Yeah,
that to me seems to be straightforward. I really do want to be able to move on because I'm conscious of the time, and we've still got another item to do after we've knocked off these recommendations. Eleanor, do you have a very quick point, please?
Yeah, very quick point. I mean, I just wanted to say that the Local Government Association, I believe, recommends, makes it mandatory to declare membership of certain organisations. I actually profoundly disagree with what Councillor Twist just said, in that some people are clearly not reporting things that they should be reporting, even under the Local Government Association guidelines. And I just think that if we add a requirement to do so, then, you know, as and when such interests become known to other people, that there is a mechanism for pointing out that they should be reported and they should be lodged somewhere. I can't see any problem.
Yeah, I think that is exactly the reason for doing this. Is it just ups the standards all over, and I think that has to be a good thing. Okay, let's go back then. I think now we need to go back to the recommendations as listed at the top of this section, if I'm correct. We have recommendation 1 is about the standards in public life best practice recommendations, which we have gone through. Does somebody want to move that? Henry, are you happy that you've got all the comments you would need to make that?
Shall I summarise what I understand the position we reached, and then obviously we can vote? So I mentioned in the introduction that the council will need to reply to the chairman of the committee, and I'm happy to write a letter in conjunction with the chair for that. But in terms of the specific best practice, bullying was to change the wording to amalgamate the LGA proposed wording in the draft code to include our wording in relation to coercion, to include harassment and the LGA's wording on the Equality Act. And I apologise to Martin because I didn't include it in here. I had seen that actually, but I hadn't included it because we weren't specifically talking about harassment. It was talking about the bullying bit. But yes, including the wording on harassment. Secondly, to acknowledge that on sort of stakeholder engagement on the code, that we'll probably be looking at a three-year cycle in terms of engaging more widely, but that we will do one imminently on that to satisfy that requirement. There was no particular comment on 4 in terms of going back to the committee, other than to note that we will look at whether or not it could go onto the app, whether the app could display the code. 7, I've just written 2. Oh yes, that's to recruit 2 independent persons. And then 9, the breach letters. So if a breach is found, then those letters will be published. So those are all the sort of the nuances that come out of the best practice recommendations. And I would suggest that the committee adopt that and that we write to the committee on that basis.
Is somebody happy to propose that, and we put that to the vote for the committee?
Yeah,
Dean,
very happy to propose. Yeah, very happy.
I can say, okay, Dean's hand and Phil shouted, so that's 2.
Go for Dean.
Dean proposed that. Do we want to vote on that recommendation 1 with those comments made by Henry?
I would.
Yeah. So we go to a vote. Do we want to vote with our hands, with our green ticks and crosses, or how do we cope with the independent members not using the little buttons? If you look along the top of your Zoom menu bar,
well, it's only the committee who votes. It's only the vote. Yeah.
Right, so that's easy. So recommendation 1 as presented, please vote.
You got that, Sarah?
Yes, Chair, it's 5 votes in favour, no votes against.
Thank you. Recommendation 2, 3 and 4, Henry's already suggested that actually this needs further work. So we may actually want to propose that this comes back to a further committee meeting, if I'm right, with comments on that. I think the feeling of overall is that there seems to be positive thoughts of what can be done, but we need to understand the practicalities.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm happy to propose that, Chair.
Thank you, Eleanor. Is everybody happy that we go ahead on that basis with those 2 recommendations, 2, 3 and 4, basically move those to be a report and bring back to standards? Can we vote on that?
Chair, that's 5 votes in favour, no votes against.
Thank you. Recommendation 5 was about the change to the register of interest forms, which again I thought was broadly supported by people, with the issue of practicality to be looked at. So to make the changes we can make now and then look at the practicality of making further changes. Is that correct, Henry?
Yeah, so the changes that we will make are those that are where Councillor Hayward's and the dummy one are side by side. So we'll make those ones, but bring a further report on the Rydale approach to register of interest.
I'm also happy to propose that recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you. We've got Councillor Rylance, Councillor Twist, Councillor Barrow waving in support. Okay, can we vote now, please?
Chair, 5 votes in favour, no votes against.
Thank you. Finally, recommendation 6 was this aspect of reviewing the personal and prejudicial interests that would require to be declared under the Code of Conduct. I think that also is, we should need somebody to propose that.
I'm very happy to propose that one, Chair.
So can I just, so that's going to be a further report in respect of implementing a personal and prejudicial, and what that would look like. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, can we vote on that one now, please?
Chair, I have 3 votes in favour with 1 vote against.
Okay, thank you. Right, thank you. That completes that section. I think we now move on, whizzing down the agenda, to the item dealing with the dispensation. Item 8, that is, and a report will be presented by Henry.
I don't think I really need to say anything, Chair. Actually, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Hayward is here, and he is permitted to talk on this, as in the law allows him to talk on it, if you were so minded.
Councillor Hayward, do you wish to say anything, or is it you think it's pretty self-explanatory?
If I can just say a few words, Chair. Again, I thank Henry for his report to you all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I know this doesn't come up very often, and members like myself, are probably fed up with hearing me declare the same declarations over and over again. And actually, in essence, this dispensation request is more for the interests, the prejudicial pecuniary interests of my partner, in that they do work for the NHS, and that I'm seeking the dispensation primarily because we as a council do discuss the NHS, and the ward members of Yardley, and in my current role as a cabinet member and in economic terms, I think the public would expect me to participate and engage, as would any member, in matters that relate to public health. But I understand that because my partner works for the NHS, in real terms, I should step aside. I shouldn't participate. I shouldn't vote. I shouldn't even be in the room. And on occasions, members here will be aware that I have asked Henry's advice on whether I should leave the room, simply for the interests of probity. In terms of my employment as a clerk to parish councils, all those parish councils are in East Devon. And again, I declare those interests. And only the other day at the discussion at Cabinet about the Newton Poppleford neighbourhood plan, I suggested that I step aside, and as it was, I didn't vote on the matter either. Now, it's very unlikely that anything this council does will impact on my pecuniary interests as a parish clerk, and certainly as the ability of my wife to continue working for the NHS. But it's all about perception. So this dispensation really is sought with the committee's agreement, just to allow me to stay in the room and vote. Now, if, let's say, and this is a purely hypothetical situation, this council were to discuss the revision of district ward boundaries, and that ward boundary review, let's just say for the sake of argument, propose that Newton Poppleford be absorbed into Collerton, Raleigh, Aylesbury, Ottery, then effectively, yes, that would have a direct pecuniary impact on myself. And at that point, I would step away from the conversation. Of course I would. And if I remained in it, I would expect any member here to challenge me on it and, bring me to account. But it's unlikely that would happen. But if it did, then I still understand my obligations. But this is simply a technical point. I will have to check with Henry that if the dispensation is afforded, whether I will still have to make those declarations at the beginning. If so, I'll quite happily do it. But it just means I won't have to step away at a time when the public would expect me to remain. And thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak in my own support. Thank you.
Thank you. This, to me, seems to be a fairly straightforward issue, given the tenuous link between the issues that Councillor Hayward's got on this form and the activities of the council. But I'm interested to hear views of people who think we shouldn't grant the dispensation. Councillor Bond?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Councillor Hayward is absolutely right. It's about perceptions. I think we're really fortunate here to have the independent members of the committee, and I think I'd like to hear their view. They are the nearest thing we have to the man on the Clapham omnibus. I personally feel uncomfortable about this, so hearing their views would be really helpful. Thank you.
Pauline, I can see you waving.
Thank you, Chairman. If you set a precedence in this, then it means that anybody in the council can come and ask for their role, whatever they want for dispensation. And I just think it's setting a bad thing, because, I mean, there's lots of people who've got perhaps somebody working for the NHS, so we're going to get everybody who wants, this to happen to them, so that they can vote at meetings or stay in the room. I just think it's wrong that we set a precedence for one person. Sorry. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Twiss?
Happy to hear the independent views first, if I may, Chair. Thank you.
Actually, I'd quite like them to hear what the members have to say first. Can you, if you have a point about why you think this is a bad idea, perhaps, or a good idea, please, can you?
Perfectly happy to do that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we've just had a discussion about declaring interests. and why we should do that, why we should be as open and transparent as we can be. There's a very clear conflict of interest here between setting a precedent, and it would be a precedent within this council. The issue of transparency, perception, public perception, particularly with regard to planning. There's all sorts of alarm bells going off in my head at the moment. It may sound like an innocent enough request, which I suspect it is. In fact, I'm sure it is, but it isn't in terms of public perception. How many instances have we actually had where there have been a conflict of interest with Councillor Hayward, as he's outlined? Not that many. One at Newton Poppleford. I'm perfectly happy for him to spend a few seconds before each meeting, as I have done today, explaining what my declarations of interest are. Turning specifically to Mrs. Hayward, who appears to be the main reason why he's asking for this dispensation. Again, at the start of this meeting, you will recall that I declared an interest in, I sit on the Council of Governors at the RD&E NHS Trust, and I'm very confident that in her role, which is described as a trainee phlebotomist in terms of being a healthcare assistant, that's a very valuable job that she does. But what she's not involved within, she's not involved in any decision which involves financial. She doesn't work with the CCG in conjunction with DCC or the NHS. She doesn't have any strategic input or oversight of decisions made by the NHS. We've also, within the report, got mention of a couple of family members who appear to have involvement within the healthcare system. Again, go back to the previous item. Whereabouts do you draw the line? Whereabouts does that interest end, that financial interest? Put simply, I can't support this application. I think it would set a dangerous precedent, and I will be voting against it. Thank you.
Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Chair. In the 1980s, we used to call these no-brainers. I think what Councillor Hayward has done, using himself as an excellent example, is to show that if you want to remove the possibility of subjective judgments on quite what I should declare, you see, there's a corollary to this, isn't there? It's that what Councillor Hayward or somebody following this same method will have achieved is a complete understanding within the council of their interests, and it will also mean, and that's on the record to be read, and similarly it will not waste time at the beginning of meetings where people go through a rigmarole. At the moment you get almost a comedy of people declaring, I'm a county councillor, I once went to see a rugby match with the Exeter Chiefs, and you just think, oh, well, I mean, what is this? What, you know, there's no actual, there's no clarity in this. So I think what Councillor Hayward is trying to achieve here is both saving time for the committee, for any committees he's on, and it has come up with Newton Poppleford, neighbourhood planning applications and so forth, and he's a clerk at two others as well. Now, without going into it, I well remember councillors in the very recent past, even a predecessor of Councillor Hayward in Newton Poppleford, who, you know, well, anyway, it's very good to make it very clear about when you're a clerk and also a councillor. If you're a clerk somewhere else as well, it's absolutely imperative, and I think this achieves it, and I think it will save time. And I think it's something we should all follow. The example he has got within his own life is to do with the NHS. Now, of course, Councillor Twist, you'd be irrelevant in this, wouldn't you? Because you're not earning any money. Well, I assume you're not. I'm sure you aren't. As one of the amateur governors, you know, lay governors on the RD&E Trust. So you don't have an interest there. But clearly, Councillor Hayward would. You know, if it comes to the suggestion of a closure of a particular hospital or type of hospital, there's that. But these issues go out of the public sector into the private sector as well, do they not? So it just helps with the whole clarification, I think, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rylance.
I'm going to be possibly agree with Councillor Twiss and with Councillor Stott, bizarrely. I actually don't feel it's particularly onerous. And I know Councillor Hayward is very happy to declare these things at the beginning of every meeting and also to offer to step back. I'm always very mindful of unintended consequences and repercussions further down the line with other less well-intentioned councillors or, you know, other situations. And I actually think it's good practice to carry on declaring these interests, not least for the issue of public perception. And so, you know, even though I respect Councillor Hayward and understand his motivations and, you know, realise that he's incredibly open and honest in his involvements in things, I'm just concerned about misuse of a precedent later. And so on that basis, I don't think I can support this, I'm afraid. That's what I have to contribute.
Thank you, Councillor Rylance. I can see, Councillor Hayward, you've got your hand up again, but actually I'd quite like to check something with Henry first. It's my understanding that obviously we would have to approve any further applications for dispensations that came forward, and we don't always have to approve them. So I know precedent is a kind of thing, but it's up to the committee about whether we would or we wouldn't approve it. And also, isn't this also related to whether, although technically these things are declared by Councillor Hayward as pecuniary interest because he earns money from his parish council work, but actually the issues that he's involved with on district council don't affect the parish councils and his role as a clerk. So it's that clash between what is where he gets paid and where he has a DPI is also involved here. Am I correct about that, Henry?
So I'm not sure quite what you're asking in relation to the second bit.
Well, the fact that he's excluded from participating in discussions about parish council matters because he's a clerk, but actually the matters he's talking about with the parish councils, nothing that EDDC is deciding is affecting his job as clerk, except for the example of boundary changes that he brought up, where of course it would. So it's separating those things out, isn't it?
Well, yes. Yeah. The issue about the DPI only arises where there is a DPI and the dispensation only acts against the DPI. So there will be cases where, and it goes back to a judgment call, doesn't it? Of is there a disclosable pecuniary interest in the matter under discussion? And I think that, perhaps Councillor Hayward will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's an element of a safety net here as well of just making sure one doesn't inadvertently trip over a DPI. Given the nature of the roles.
Sorry, you'll have to excuse me, sorry.
I forgot what the first question was now. Oh, yes, precedent. Well, yes, the committee would have to approve it. I have authority to grant two, but they wouldn't be relevant for this kind of issue. They're to do with something else. But if it doesn't fall within my remit and the ones which would cause concern don't, then it would be for the committee to decide whether or not to grant any other dispensations.
Councillor Barrow's got his hand up when the chair comes back.
Apologies, as a consequence, having spent 9 hours in a meeting yesterday, more than the time I wanted to have this morning. I'm a bit being pushed by other issues. I really apologise for that. Yes, Councillor Barrow.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking at the report given and going to point 3. An authority may only grant a dispensation where various points, and then you go to point 6. So the advice from our monitoring officer says it is difficult to see how A, B, or D would be met. And, you know, whether I've got a personal opinion of this, sometimes I go to the professional officers, and as he said, only grant where these are met. And if they can't be, then 3 out of 5 can't be met. Then I have to go against giving this dispensation.
Can I just clarify? You don't have to meet all 5.
No, but
only one needs to be met.
Okay, but if 3 out of 5 are knocked out straight away, then
I think, to be fair to the topic that we're looking at, irrespective of who it is, I think the nature of the work is a factor of whether you meet these criteria or not. So I think if some things are not going to apply, and that isn't a count against the application, it's more whether one of them definitely does in order to qualify for it. Is that correct, Henry? Because I think it's very difficult for something to meet a lot of these. It just doesn't happen. Yeah. So I think you're judging very harshly on that one, Councillor Barrow, if I may say so, because it depends on the situation that we're looking at. I'll just go back to my... before Councillor Hayward comments again, Councillor Twist, I know you're against giving this dispensation. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, it was just really making the point that I do have a modicum of sympathy, but it is unfortunate that Councillor Hayward is both a councillor and employed by parish clerks. That's not the fault or anything to do with the district council. It's just the way it is. And we are governed by, as we've discussed at length this morning, perception largely is what we're governed by, and we're governed by the law. And the law says very clearly you should be declaring DPIs. So I just want to amplify the fact it's the good fortune of those parish councils that employ him to have him as an employee, but that is his choice. I mean, he could always resign from the council and perhaps have a by-election, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Thank you, Chair.
Yes, but I think surely the point is that that's why the council has the power to offer dispensations, is that there are circumstances where there's just where the dispensation is more helpful to the work of the councillor, and they will still have that interest recorded in their register of interests.
But that's a matter of opinion. These are not exceptional circumstances because it's not something that happens every day. Thank you.
I think, given the discussions we've already had in this committee, I think several of us can think of examples where councillors need to be more careful in their declarations of interest. And that's something that we will be looking to change in the new forms and the way that we take that forward.
Indeed, but we're not talking about other ones. We're talking about this request, Chair.
We are, but I think that is extremely relevant. Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure everyone in the room has read sections 31 to 34 inclusive of the Localism Act 2011 before they discussed and considered this matter, because they are the relevant things. Yes, Councillor Twist is quite right. I work for parish councils. I knew that before I stood to be a district councillor. My wife was working for the NHS before I became a district councillor. But actually, if I may, there's 2 separate issues here, and I touched on this earlier and sought clarification from our monitoring officer. What I'm not proposing is that I will not declare interests as they come up. That's still a requirement. I'm not seeking any exemption from the law to declare. You'll still have to listen to me declare these things, and the meeting will still drag on a little bit longer while I make them. What it comes down to is, what's of more benefit to this district? Is it me as one of 60 members having a frank and open discussion about hospital services, be it hubs or dentistry or midwifery or anything that falls under the edict of the RD&E in Exeter? My other 2 children don't work for the RD&E, so they don't actually work in this district. They work in other places, but effectively they still work for the NHS. So it's essentially what you're considering is, what is the public benefit? Is there more public benefit to me exempting myself because my wife goes out and helps elderly people rehabilitate themselves? And as Councillor Twist says, she has no involvement. I can't perceive any situation where this council will make a resolution or a decision that would affect her employment 1 iota. If it did, I would naturally declare the interest and choose, as any member can, to remove myself. If the interest was that important, I would still remove myself. But if the discussion was about offering a £50 loan to Budley Salterton Hub, on the current basis, I would still have to remove myself from that discussion. My wife doesn't work at Budley Salterton. It could be Sidmouth. So this is the point I'm trying to put in my report. It's all subjective. Any member here who has a partner who cleans a toilet at LED should remove themselves from any discussion about LED. But would a cleaner at a toilet of an LED facility be impacted by any decision we make? If that is belief, then so be it. But is the ability of that member to have a full and frank involvement in a discussion about the affairs of LED more important to East Devon than the fact that their partner just happens to work for that organisation? And that could apply for any organisation. It does come back to the fact that several members of this authority haven't declared what their partners do. I have. I've been full and frank in this, and I think that there's a slight confusion as to what's going to be done here. This isn't exempting me from anything. It simply allows me, in the public interest, to have discussions on a wider topic. Arguably, and of course the law is quite hazy on this, any district council who happens to be a county councillor, should you even discuss matters that involve Devon County Council, you should remove yourself because you receive a remuneration from Devon County Council, but you don't. And several members discuss it on a regular basis. Or I suppose my exasperation is, this is what the Localism Act, section 31 to 34, was made for, is to consider exceptional circumstances. There is only one other clerk, I believe, in the entire UK who clerks for the same parishes that they are ward member for. It's truly exceptional. When that other gentleman passes away or retires, I will be the only one. So this is what the Localism Act is for. But if you don't afford it, I'm not, throwing all my toys out the pram. It will make no difference to me because life will continue the same. I will still declare, and if the topic comes up, I will remove myself. But I personally believe that East Devon and East Devon residents will be better served by me as one of 60 discussing issues that are relevant to their lives and their health and their day-to-day well-being than it is for me to step aside because my wife helps elderly people rehabilitate their walking. Similarly, as a role of a parish clerk, I declare those interests anyway, and there's very little this committee or this council could do that would influence my work. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think that's important clarification. I have to say, when I first looked at this, my initial thinking was, well, why would we have a dispensation? Then I understood the implications of what is you're needing to do at the moment and how it limits your involvement in work from a connection which is not actually affected by what you're doing, and that's the issue. And it took me a while to get my head around that, and I think that is an important distinction. You will still be declaring DPIs when they apply. That is not removed by this. And if it is absolutely direct, you will remove yourself. Councillor Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair. Councillor Hayward, I believe in the last year, there's been occasions where you have offered to step back from a meeting on the grounds that you've mentioned. And committee members have said, no, there's no need because, they've discussed it for maybe 90 seconds and decided that the level of involvement or the link was not going to be so substantial as to influence your decision making. I mean, I seem to remember there's been occasions when that's happened, and I just feel like it could be considered on a case-by-case basis, given that it's going to be a relatively few occasions on which it happens. I mean, I'm not sure it's worth having a principle drawn up for, to be honest. That's just my penny's worth.
Henry, do you have a final comment on
Well,
that?
I think I also be clear exactly what it is that's being or is on the table, if you like, from the legal perspective. So if you have a sorry, my phone's gone off. If you have a disclosable pecuniary interest, you are obliged to enter it onto the register of interests. And if you haven't, you are supposed to then notify me as soon as you are aware of it. And failing that, at a meeting, you are supposed to declare it if it isn't on the register, blah, blah, blah. the requirement to disclose at a meeting arises where it is in relation to the matter that is under consideration. It's not a generalised matter. It's if the DPI is in relation to the matter that is under consideration. And that still subsists. The dispensation acts to avoid the criminal sanctions that would flow from remaining and discussing and then voting on a matter in which you have a dispensation. In which you have a DPI. The dispensation precludes you from being prosecuted for non-declaration or removal of the meeting. So that's the framework within which it operates. I just want to be clear, from what Councillor Rylance was saying about the committee allowing Councillor Hayward to remain, that's not right. It is the councillors' obligations to disclose, to remove themselves, and if they don't, then they have a criminal sanction or potential criminal sanction or a criminal offence committed. And the dispensation protects against that.
Yeah, so it's allowing for that common sense approach on what's being discussed. I think we should put this to the vote because I think further discussion probably won't help the committee make a decision one way or the other.
You need to be, sorry, Kathy, you need to be very clear though. What? So first of all, what the dispensation relates to and how long for, because there are two elements to the dispensation here. You've got the relevant persons interest, which is Councillor Hayward's wife, I believe, who works for the NHS. So that's one aspect. And then you've got his own, which is the clerk. So you need to consider which one or both or neither you would be considering. And you might also want to consider the extent of that and then how long for. And I would suggest if you are going to, that you probably limit it to the next election, because then of course you could renew it on election.
So first of all, we have a dispensation relating to Councillor Hayward's wife, then, specifically.
Well, it would permit him to remain in a meeting where an interest he has in relation to her employment arises.
Yes, and also that would be under 3C. I think 3C would be the section that applies from the list of reasons. Up until the next election is the time period.
Point of order, Chairman, we haven't heard from the independent people. I think we haven't heard from Martin, we've heard from Councillor Stott, but I think it'd be really helpful to have his views.
Okay, I'm suffering seriously from brain fade and the need for a natural break. So we're approaching an appalling length of time on this meeting overall. I'm absolutely knackered after yesterday and I have to apologise for my language, but I am so tired. This is 3 hours in now. Yes, would the independent people like to just comment on whether they think this dispensations should be granted? Perhaps take them separately, put Councillor Hayward's wife and the one for himself as clerk. Martin, do you want to go first?
I've got to be honest, I didn't have hugely strong views when I read the paper originally. I've listened with interest. I think I would be concerned if this creates an undesirable precedent, but I stress the word is undesirable, and I'm not really qualified to know whether it would be undesirable or not. I've got to be quite honest about that. But I would clearly be concerned if it did create some kind of precedent that had a downside that was negative to the authority. I looked at the circumstances in which the dispensation can be granted. I've got to be honest that I wasn't on either of the two applications. If we're looking at this as two applications, one in respect of Councillor Hayward's role as a clerk or member of clerks, and one in respect of his wife, I didn't feel that C felt awfully compelling for either of them, in the sense that I didn't see why it would be in the interest of persons living in the authority area particularly to justify a dispensation. So I felt that if it was agreed, it would likely to be under E rather than C. I think that's probably as far as I went. So I don't have awfully strong views. I also thought about the time limit side, and I didn't realise until Henry qualified just a moment ago that the maximum period of 4 years could be extended effectively for another period. I rather assumed it said what it said, and that 4 years was the absolute maximum and couldn't be renewed, which at the time I thought might be a problem. I should add one last thing, which is that looking at this in a common sense way, and trying to think what members of the public would see when they thought about occasions when Councillor Hayward might be involved in decision making, it's very difficult to argue, I would have thought, that any matter coming before the district council that looks at health matters could possibly be prejudiced by Councillor Hayward's wife's employment. And in that regard, it makes me very warm to a dispensation if that is a sensible way forward to address that problem. But in the case of clerk to areas that fall within the geographical area of the district council, I probably am more concerned, thinking again about members of the public, that a clerk is, one of the roles of the clerk is bound to be to give advice to members of the council on matters that are coming before that council. And I could see some kind of conflict on that side where I couldn't see a conflict in respect of his wife. So I wonder whether there could be a thought that to approve the dispensation in respect of Councillor Hayward's wife's employment, but not to approve it in respect of his roles as clerk. And that's as far as I could suggest.
Okay. I think, I'm not sure that we still have Bob with us. I think he's probably crashed a bit like me at the moment. I think therefore we probably should go back now then to considering the dispensation for Councillor Hayward's wife. And I think the point whether it's C or E, I think I would consider it's C, because the issues are around aspects related to health and public health in the district that Councillor Hayward may be involved in discussing and taking a vote on as a member, which affects people living in the local authorities area. That's the only reason why I would think it would come under C. Does it matter, Henry, whether we say it's C or E?
Yes, you need to say which one it is.
My feeling is it's C, because this is health and public health aspects related to people in East Devon. So that is the reason we would give the dispensation, so that Councillor Hayward could play a part in those discussions. And a district council has very little, if any, actual powers over healthcare decisions related to the NHS anyway. So this is particularly remote. Do we want to have a vote on this dispensation first, Henry? Can we move to a vote?
Yes, if you'd like, if you want to take it in two different parts, that's absolutely fine. So can I just clarify one thing, which was something Martin said about the 4 years, extending to 4 years. That's a different. When I was talking about it earlier in the meeting, that was a different matter. The 4 years here is prescribed in legislation. You can only grant a dispensation up to 4 years, up to a maximum of 4 years. There's no reason why that couldn't be renewed time immemorial, effectively, but each time it can only be for 4 years. So yes, it's for the committee to decide. You're proposing it on subsection C, that's in interest of persons living in the authorities area. You're proposing that there is a blanket dispensation for discussing NHS matters for Councillor Hayward in relation to his partner's employment with them. And I suggested you put it up to the next election date, but that's for the committee to decide.
That seems to make sense to me. I can't see a reason for making it shorter than that.
To be clear, Chair, then, if we're supporting that request, it's a yes, and if we're not, it's a no. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
The green tick for yes, red cross for no.
Okay, can we put it to the vote now, please?
One, two in favour and 3 against.
On that basis, I think it's impossible that we will get the second dispensation passed because there's no support for the most straightforward of those two, and there's been dissent already from the voting members about granting it for a clerk. Do we need to proceed to vote, Henry?
Well, unless Councillor Hayward withdraws it, he's entitled to no.
I'll withdraw, Chair. It's pointless exercise. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hayward. Henry, we're moving on now to the final item, which is you have a report here on the complaints. Do you have any comments to make on the complaints?
No, it was only perhaps just to explain that there were two sets. The first is the previous year, which is the table of formal complaints, and then a table at the end of matters that didn't progress to complaint. And then the next table is the in-year table, again with a list at the end of matters that haven't progressed. So it is what it is. There's only one correction to make, which is merely a consistency point, which is in 2020 CO7, which is under progression. That ought to include bringing the council into disrepute as well. So it's 4A and 5H. But otherwise, I'm happy to answer any questions there may be. You will appreciate it's anonymised for a reason. So it's not always the most interesting of exercises, but I am very happy to answer any questions there may be.
I don't see any comments on this. Susie. Councillor Bond, you put your blue hand up. I can't hear you, Susie.
I apologise. Henry, could we look at 2019 CO2 as a town council one, where there was a disclosable pecuniary interest, but there was finding of no breach. So somebody had a DPI but didn't have a DPI. I just wondered how those two came about. So I should have given you a page.
Yes, so it was an allegation that it was a DPI. So it wasn't that there was a DPI, but there was an allegation that there was a DPI that wasn't declared. But upon investigation, there wasn't a DPI.
Okay, thank you.
Or at least if there was a DPI, it wasn't in the matter that was under consideration. I can't quite remember off the top of my head now which it was, but I think it was probably the former.
Presumably these are just for noting, Chair, these
yes.
maps. Yeah.
Councillor Arnott, you've put your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. If it's a DPI, I'd like to ask Henry, I'd love to know from Susie the page number on this, because I can't find it as well. Thank you. But Henry, if it's a DPI, how do you make the decision about whether to refer it to the police, even if it's an allegation of the DPI? In other words, how do you make your own assessment? Because if it's a DPI, that's a criminal allegation, isn't it, effectively? So what is your threshold for passing it across to Devon and Cornwall Police?
Well, if I think there is a valid or a DPI that hasn't been declared in a matter that the council was considering it, then yes, I would be considering referral. I haven't had a situation where actually there is, or it's not like I can think off the top of my head, the one where there is that is relevant to refer. We do get allegations, but in terms of what I have considered, they either haven't arisen in relation to the matter under consideration, or they weren't DPIs in the first place.
Chair, I'm just seeking clarification on this. So you're acting in a sort of, I'm trying to work out where under the Localism Act, not you personally, Henry, but where a monitoring officer sits. What you're doing is you're doing something, it's a bit like this, well, it's the other end of the process to the CPS, isn't it? In a way, you are the gatekeeper who is making a decision whether in your view, which is fair enough, you think there is a DPI there, where presumably the complainant at the point, who may be, might be a judge, who knows, feels there is, and then you have to go back to the complainant and say, no, there isn't a DPI. So what what recourse do they have next? What can they then do?
Well, they can refer it straight to the police if they like. So there are within sort of my remit, if you like, there are two aspects to it. One is the straight criminal offence, and that is purely a matter for the police. So if there is a DPI that is sort of, put in quotes, worthy for the police, and that can be referred straight on to them. If I don't, for whatever reason, and the complainant is unhappy, they can make the complaint to the police themselves for the police to investigate. It doesn't have to come through me. But the secondary tier is that, of course, it can still be a breach of the code of conduct in failing to declare a DPI. So you can still deal with this at a lower level too, at a sort of civil level, if you like, rather than the criminal. So yeah, there are two tiers within my consideration of it. But ultimately, if somebody's unhappy with my view about not referring it to the police, they can make the referral themselves. And the complaint form, I think, makes that clear. Not the complaint form, the process makes that clear.
Through you, Chair, can I start with another 15-second comment, and that'll be that, which is that I can understand that reply, but what concerns me here is that, let's say for sake of argument, this did then become part of a live criminal prosecution that actually came to court, then an argument for the defence would absolutely be that the monitoring officer at the person who was alleged against own authority had already taken the view that there had not been a crime committed. And we've got to crack this one somehow. And it's just a sort of exiting comment, really, Chair, which is how much I believe it would help our monitoring officer to have this independent assessment committee there, so that he doesn't have to make that kind of decision, because it could end up in a pretty dark place in a live courts process, arguably. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think that's actually an interesting example of where a assessment subcommittee could come in really useful. Okay, I think that draws to a close that item on the agenda. No other comments to make. Finally, forward plan. I really need to draw this meeting to a close because I am really struggling. I'm starting to get an appalling headache after 3 hours on this, 9 hours yesterday. Do we have any urgent items of a forward plan? And then we can draw the meeting to a close.
Oh, is that for me?
Anybody really?
Yeah, so I haven't. I think I've got enough work from this morning as it is.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think we've already got items of the forward plan that have been carried over from previous items.
Yeah, nothing springs to mind, Chair.
Yeah, I think we need to draw this meeting to a close. This draws our meeting to an end. I'd like to thank everyone, including any members of the public watching online, for taking part. I'll just remind all those present that supporting officer will confirm when the meeting is no longer being recorded or going live. And until then, your comments will be live to the public. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Hi, Chair.